All right, welcome back. If you're watching the recording, we're just getting started here. We did a quick little review on what we discussed yesterday. Today, we're going to talk about some formatting ideas, some starting points for how we're going to format different kinds of information, and then we're going to talk about some different resume styles, because those are going to help us with emphasis as well. Yesterday, we looked at that letterhead, and I'm going to jump into a blank Word document here and quickly just remind us all kind of what we want to accomplish here with our letterhead. We want to make sure the person who is reading it knows who this document is about. And this is one thing that I think we want to keep in mind. We want our resume to work for the applicant tracking system, the software that is scanning our document for keywords. But even when we're successful there, it's going to go to a human being, and a human is going to look at it at some point. And so that means it's got to work in both of these worlds. We're trying to find balance between the software that is screening or scanning our documents and the human being that's looking at it, trying to learn about who we are. So we want it to work in both worlds. As I said yesterday, if you are including your address, so like, let's say, for example, I was including my street address, I would include the city and province, and I would include the postal code as well. I can't remember what a good postal code would be, so I'll make one up. If I'm including the street address, I'm including the postal code. If I'm not including the street address, I'm not including the postal code. So in this case, because I want to fit my LinkedIn in the document, I'm going to I'm also going to drop my street address. I'm going to stick with just the city and province. For the province here, it'll depend on how much room you have. You can always use the two-letter abbreviation. If that is the case, I would recommend you use consistent abbreviations throughout. So if you're abbreviating, for example, provinces, one second here. There we go. So if you're abbreviating provinces, you can absolutely do the two-letter abbreviation, or you can do the four-letter abbreviation, or you can just type the whole long thing out, whatever your preference is, but then be consistent throughout. If that's how you're abbreviating things or shortening them, here, do the same in other places. To save space, I'm going to keep my province short because I'm going to put all my contact information on one line. If I was stacking these, one piece of information on top of the other, I would probably write out the full word. I try to avoid abbreviations when possible. And of course, I've got a phone number. But one thing we don't want to do when we're including a phone number is just put all the numbers like this in a string together. Makes it hard to read. It makes it more likely that we're going to get errors when someone is typing it or inputting it into a phone. So I'm going to put spaces in. In fact, I'm going to put dashes, because that's probably how I would do it. And of course, we'll have an email address. Don't worry, all of this is going somewhere. I know you've seen this before. And like I said, I do want my name to be the largest thing on the page. I want it to stand out to that employer. And let's say I had an underline. I like the underline. I think it looks good. I'm going to maybe reduce this one. Stop there. So this could be a letterhead. Someone could absolutely use this. We could also put all of this on one line and create separation using, let's go, a square bullet. Let's do this. Oops. And we'll do one more. And of course, like I said, if we're including our LinkedIn, I would make sure things are spelled correctly. I could do that. There we go. You'll notice here with this, I could put in the www. We don't need it. Employers are going to recognize that it's a website. And if they copy and paste this into a web browser, they're going to go to that link directly. You could also make this a hyperlink, and then you can make sure that it does link correctly. And I would keep this as short as possible so that it looks good. We'll center this for now because I think it's going to look pretty nice. And there we go. We've got a letterhead, a good start for our document. Now, what I did was I opened a blank document using the default settings. And depending on where you got your copy of Microsoft Word and what your settings are listed as, that may work, or we may want to make some adjustments. And so we've got a document here of, once again, created a letterhead that I think is going to be pretty effective. And it only took me about, 30 seconds to a minute. I could probably teach anyone to do this in 10 or 15 minutes. We're using as simple formatting as possible so that when we need to make changes or edits, it's easy to do. Now let's go back into our slides here and we'll take a look. You'll see on the screen here, or it should pop up, there we go, what we might call an ideal resume. And this is a starting point. One thing I mentioned yesterday is the idea of a universal document. Universal meaning it's going to work in as many situations as possible. One thing that you'll hear me say all the time in my workshops when people say, well, what's an employer going to do here? Or how's an employer going to do this? The answer is, I don't know. There are hundreds, thousands of employers, and each one has their own way of screening candidates. Even within the same organization, different managers, supervisors are going to screen candidates in different ways. There may be a set policy for that organization. Well, first we do this, then we do this. Here's the set of questions that we ask in the interview. But each person has their own style. So does a hiring manager look at it as a PDF on their phone, or do they print it out and look at it while they sit at their desk? We don't know. I want to create a resume that works in both of those situations. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of things that are outside of our control. One of the things that we do control is the formatting and presentation of our documents. So let's take control of what we are able to take control of, and let's make sure that when the employer opens our documents, they see exactly what we want them to see. So on the screen, I've got what I would describe as ideal formatting. This is a starting place. Some of this we have flexibility, and some of this we don't. As a general rule, though, I would say letter size paper is the size of page that an employer is going to be looking at our document on. If they're looking at it on a screen, on a monitor on their phone, they may not notice if our document is, let's say, A4 instead of letter, but this is the standard page size in Canadian offices. If you buy a printer in Canada, its default setting will be letter size paper, 8.5 inches by 11 inches. So you can thank our proximity to the United States, but we will be using letter size in all of our documents that we send to an employer. So 8.5 inches wide, 11 inches tall in portrait, so vertical. This is the size they'll print it on. This is the size they're comfortable looking at. This is going to look normal to an employer. Now, if you've been sending employers documents on A4, the odds are they haven't noticed. The odds are they probably didn't care, and it probably didn't make a huge difference. But every once in a while, it will change the scaling or the size of the document on the page, or it could change where the page break happens, especially if you have to send them a document that can be edited. So if you sent them a PDF, probably not a big deal. It may have gotten resized or reformatted to a degree. If you sent them a document that can be edited, it could be an issue. We don't know, so we take care of it up front. It can be as simple as going into your Word document and going to the Layout tab and taking a look at your page size, which is going to be in the top left-hand corner. Right about here. There we are. So we go to our page size, and what you're going to see is letters here, 8.5 by 11. A4 is just down at the bottom of our page here, 8.27 by 11.69. So slightly narrower and a little bit longer, and so it can have an impact on how a document prints. It's going to be a big problem? Probably not. But what we're trying to do is avoid a lot of little things that make an employer look at a resume and go, huh, why is that happening? And when you add all those little things up, they can sometimes turn into a bigger problem. So if you don't have letter as a default setting, you can always go in and down here at the bottom, I'll show you. I'm just going to go and create a custom size if I need to, and set my width and height accordingly. Little things, but little things can have a big impact. Now, once we've got our page size set, I would recommend starting with a 1-inch margin. Okay, is that where we're going to settle? Maybe not. We do have some flexibility here. Oh, where'd that go? 1 second here. Oh, that's strange. This should work. Let's see here. Yeah. All right. I want to give you an example here, but I had the wrong document open. Classic Dale. Here we go. Let's jump in. I'm going to send you some of these templates later on today, so you'll get a chance to take a look at them and use them for inspiration, amongst other things. But here we are in a document. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. This is a 2-page document. On one side, we've got the template. On the other side, we've got how a person might adapt it. But that's not the thing I want to focus on right now. Currently, these all have a 1-inch margin, each of these pages. And as a general rule, when we're talking about a 1-inch margin, maybe I'll go to print preview so you can see them both kind of full screen here. One of the things that we like about a 1-inch margin is it feels balanced to the reader. So when we're looking at it, we often end up, let's just get a little closer. 1 second. There we go. What we end up with is a page, because 1 inch is the default in most word processors, it's something that people are very comfortable and familiar looking at. So it feels typical or feels normal to the reader. And it gives us a nice balance between enough information on the page while still feeling like it's not crammed in, like we've been stuffing the page with words. So it doesn't feel like a wall of text. Once we get down to about a 1/2 inch margin, the page starts to feel very cramped, very claustrophobic. By contrast, if we go more than 1 inch on the margin, it feels like everything is getting smushed into the middle of the page. So 1 inch feels pretty comfortable. I would say you can go a little bit smaller. I try to keep it between 0.65 inches and 1 inch. Once you get smaller than that, it starts to feel a little awkward or uncomfortable. I'll show you what I mean here. I needed a page that was full of text, and we've got that here. I'm just going to, I think I'll insert a page break here so it doesn't get too messy. There we go. All right. That work? There we go. This should work. Hey, you're supposed to be centered. What's going on? Okay. It took me a second, but we got it. Okay, so here we are. No. So when we end up with a margin that's slightly narrower, here's 0.75. Still feels, let's get it fully. Still feels pretty comfortable. We still feel like we've got a good amount of space around the outside. It's not going to feel overly cramped right now. And this is going to give us slightly longer widths, which is going to help reduce the amount of space we're taking up, especially if we find ourselves struggling to get onto 2 pages, or if we're just slightly onto a second page and we want to get down to 1 page. Reducing margin size is a great way to do it. But when we get too narrow, we can end up with kind of an awkward looking document. Where's my narrow margins here? At about a 1/2 inch, it starts to feel pretty cramped on the page. It's not necessarily terrible, but one other thing we run into is that we end up getting very close to the left-hand side, and when our lines don't go all the way to the right margin, it can feel like there's a lot more space on the right-hand side, especially as we get lower down on our document. So it gets a little uncomfortable. The other issue we run into is the closer we get to the edge of the page, the more likely things are to be cut off by a printer or something like that. So I would never recommend going below a 1/2 inch, but as a general rule, I would probably hang out at the 0.75 to 1 inch spot, and it's just going to feel pretty comfortable all the way around. We get that? What does this one look like? That's still at a 1/2 inch, right? There we go. Back to our slide here, and again, if you have any questions, let me know. As a general rule, when we looked at our templates yesterday, we saw a lot of color. We saw a lot of vibrant and colorful resumes when we typed that into the search. And we saw that there were some other issues with it as well, right? Columns and tables and things like that sometimes make it difficult for applicant tracking systems to find our keywords, which of course is an issue because that is what the employer is using to screen candidates in many cases. So we end up with a document that isn't going to get through that initial screening process. But even when it does, we can end up with a document that has elements like photos and, in this case, we got some bubbles or spheres. Over here, we got some kind of cloud-like shapes. Is it terrible? Is it wrong? No. Is it potentially distracting? Possibly. Does it take up space that we could be using for other information? Absolutely. And is it going to be inconsistent in the way it displays? Very often. And that can be a real problem for us. So you'll see a lot of colorful things on the various ones here. You'll also notice that colors end up getting used for headings throughout as well. And one issue we can run into is that when they print, they don't always print consistently. So there was a popular resume template on Microsoft Word that I used to see all the time. It's not super popular anymore, but for a very long time, people would send me resumes that they'd used or that they'd created using a template, and that template had a large red section at the top. Is that inherently wrong? No, but on their screen, it would look like this. So the heading would be quite red. This isn't exactly what it looked like, but the spirit of the resume was the same. So the top would look quite red, not necessarily bad. It caught the eye. The issue they would run into is that when an employer would go to print it, most offices will default to black and white to save money on ink and things like that. And so when people aren't paying attention when they're printing, what they end up with is a document that looks like this. Okay, so now this is kind of gray, not as eye-catching, and the contrast between their name and contact information isn't as much as it was earlier. Certainly not as much as between the black and the white. But then another thing would happen, which is that the printer that was being printed on would not print edge to edge. So they'd actually end up with something that looked more like this, where we've got kind of a floating rectangle at the top of our page. Is it bad? Is it terrible? No. Does it look the way the person saw it on their screen? Also no, right? Not a huge problem, but it wasn't displaying consistently across different ways of interacting. And it wasn't doing what they thought it was doing. They thought it was eye-catching. They thought it was going to attract attention. Depending on how the employer looked at it, it wasn't doing that. More so when we've got things like headings that are written in a different color, we can end up with issues where'd it go? Come on, Dale. Here we are. 1 second. We can end up with issues. That's that. Go back here. Where instead of jumping off the page, information, like for example, I see this all the time where we've got headings like this and maybe the name, and it's not in black, it's in like, let's say a bluish color like this. But instead of printing in blue, it prints in, and this creates kind of a nice aesthetic. Instead of printing in blue, it ends up printing in grayscale. And instead of being a nice dark blue, it ends up looking like a light gray. And instead of, I forgot to unpause my screen, so you have no idea what I'm talking about. Let's go back for just once. There we go. Okay, here's that resume. We'd end up with people, as I was saying, converting these colors, making their text, not that, dark blue, maybe like this. And it creates a nice little contrast here. It looks pretty good. Don't have a lot of complaints. But when it would print, it wouldn't print that way. It would print in black and white, and they would end up with text that looked like this. So a lighter gray, and it actually, instead of jumping off the page, it fades out and other things stand out more. So for example, if we look at this heading here, the professional experience is the main heading, but it's actually senior auditor, even though it's a smaller text that jumps out at us. Bad? No. Is it doing exactly what we would expect? Making it easy for the employer to find different sections and identify the information there? Makes it a little trickier. So for that reason, I generally recommend black text on a white page. It looks good, it's high contrast, and as a general rule, it's going to display consistently, no matter how the employer is deciding to look at the document. Printed, on a monitor, on a screen, on a phone, it's going to look the same, which is a piece of control that we can have when we are creating this. It also tends to look quite professional. As a general rule, I would say choose one font, choose one style of text, and then use different formatting tools to make those adjustments. So choose a readable font, a font that is easy for the employer to read, to view, and to learn about you. Make the body paragraphs or bullets 11 to 12 point, depending on what's going to be most effective. Your headings like career summary, education, work experience, those can be a little larger, your name a little larger still. But as a general rule, we don't want the text to get too small. You can fit more information, but it gets harder to read. And if no one reads it, it doesn't matter how good your bullets are or how well you've described your skills. So we're trying to find this balance where we are sharing information with the employer, we're making it easy for them to learn about us, we're fitting a good amount of information, but it's still easy to read. When we're choosing a font style, I would say simple is better. So let's go back in here. On the left-hand side of the screen, this should pop up. Come on. There we go. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see this template here is in Calibri, or Calibri, however you like to pronounce it, which used to be the default in Microsoft Word. They've changed to Aptos. And on the right-hand side, you'll see Times New Roman, which is an even older default font. Both would be fine. At a glance, ask yourself which of these is easier to read. They are both 11-point font. So this career summary here is 11-point, as is this career summary here. Two fonts. Which do you find easier to read? The one on the left has no serifs. The one on the right has serifs. So serifs are those little notches on the end of the letter, if you're not familiar with that term. I'll zoom in real close here. Those little notches at the tops and bottoms where the lines end. They're called serifs, S-E-R-I-F. And it depends on the feeling or the vibe you're going for. I would say sans serif, which means no serifs. I think they use Latin to describe that, is on the left-hand side here of the screen. A little easier to read. It's going to tend to feel a little bit more modern. I find it looks really clean. That's how I would describe it as well. On the right-hand side, it tends to look more established and more traditional. Certain industries, that might be beneficial, right? If I'm working in tech, let's say, for example, and I'm using an antiquated or old-style font, that's going to give a different impression than if maybe I'm working in a long-established financial institution or a newspaper. Something with serifs might feel a little bit more appropriate. So it's going to depend on your own personal preference as well. This is an opportunity for you to add a little personality to your document. I personally tend to go with something like Calibri. One thing I like about Calibri, everyone has it. So if I have to send a document that can be edited to an employer, maybe they ask for a Word document or something like that, I know they have that font and it's not going to substitute it. So my formatting is going to stay the same and not get messed up. If you've ever gotten a document from somebody and you didn't have the font and it substituted it, you'll see that things moved all over, lines moved to the next one because the letter width and the kerning probably changed. And so it ends up looking different. Having said all of that, you just want it to be easy to read. So, here I'll zoom in a little bit on this document here. I'm not going to go with something like that. It's not the time for a script font, right? This is going to feel too informal. It's also going to be very difficult to read. And you'll notice that some fonts don't create very effective all caps, right? So here, because it's got a script style, it's not going to create a very nice effect when we use all caps either. And as soon as we zoom out, it's virtually impossible to read, right? So not ideal. Whereas something like Cambria, not my first choice, but easy to read. And as we make it smaller, we can still make out the words. We can still probably, if we had to, depending on the size of your screen, we could probably still make out the words and read it. As soon as we add in, what's a good example here? I don't want to go too absurd. What's a font we would actually choose? Not this, for example, right? This is impossible to read already. We want to make it easy for them to learn about us. I don't want to go with anything too bold either, right? When everything is bold, nothing is bold, right? It's similar to if you were going through a textbook highlighting important information. If you highlight the whole paragraph, well, who knows what's important? So a font like this, Cooper, it's too heavy. We don't want it to feel heavy. So something kind of balanced. Even this demi-bold, Franklin Gothic is probably too bold. Like I said, keep it simple, keep it easy. I tend to stick to the defaults if I can. Some fonts are going to display smaller than others. So if you're struggling to get onto 2 pages, you might look at your font and say, maybe there's a better option for me. Calibri tends to fit pretty nicely. It's a good balance. It looks professional. It also looks contemporary. So I don't think you have to spend your entire afternoon thinking about fonts. Pick one that looks good, that you like. Use the default if you need to. And then I would say use one font for everything. You'll notice when I was adjusting the font here, I didn't pick like one font for my name and a different one for this. If you do, it's a great way to get confused, to accidentally put it in the wrong font in the wrong place. And if you've taken design, you can take entire classes about matching fonts together. Like you could write a thesis on it. So, for most of us, we're not design professionals. Keep it simple. If I've got a career summary title and a career summary, if it's all the same font, well, I'll just make my title bold and uppercase and it stands out. It does the work that it's supposed to do. So keep it simple for yourself. We don't need to make extra work. This is already a frustrating and time-consuming process. Don't make it harder. Make that font easy to read. Your goal is to get people to read it. If it's hard to read, they're not going to. And then you end up on the recycling pile, and that's no fun because you might be a great candidate. We are limited to 2 pages in 99.9% of circumstances. There are a couple of outliers. There are industries that will ask for multiple pages or more. If an employer requests a CV or curriculum vitae instead of a resume, it can probably be a little bit longer. Those tend to be more comprehensive, but many employers will use them interchangeably. As a general rule, if you are applying for a job, I would use a resume that is 2 pages or shorter. I think some people will say, Dale, I've got a lot of information I want to share. I can't get rid of this. It's important to me. I want you to remember that a resume, this is not describing everything you've done as a professional. This is an assignment. I think it's much more helpful to think of this if you've taken a university class where your professor asks you to write a paper. Think of it as a paper. You're being asked to write a persuasive paper where you convince someone to call you for an interview in 2 pages. That's the assignment. The assignment does not describe who you are as a professional completely. No. The assignment is convince me to call you for an interview in 2 pages. And if you think about it that way, it's much easier to identify which information to remove, which information to add, and what level of detail you should be talking about your skills and abilities. So you don't have to say everything that's ever happened to you. You want to talk about the reasons that they should call you for an interview. And when you get to that interview, you're going to be able to provide additional information. If you really want them to know that, all of those details, put it on your LinkedIn and share the link for your LinkedIn with them. And that will give you the same effect. If they want to read more pages, they can. If they don't, well, you haven't made them do it. So like I was saying, this is a good starting point. Your resume doesn't have to look exactly like this, and your margins might be slightly narrower. Your font might be a different font or a typeface. But it's a good starting point, and if you're not sure, this is safe. Letter size paper with 1-inch margins, black text on a white page. Most of the text, bullets and things like that are 11 point. The font is easy to read, and it's 2 pages. You know that an employer will look at that and say, yep, that's a resume, looks good. So if you're not sure, if you don't want to take any risks, that's safe, and that's a good option for us. Lastly, when you go to send it to them, we're going to save it, right? We're going to save it not as a Word doc, we're going to save it as a PDF. Now, this is where, once again, Dale says, if the employer asks for something else, we're going to do our best to meet their expectation. So if they say, send it as a Word document or send it as a rich text file, well, that's what we're going to do. If they don't say anything, send it as a PDF. As a general rule, when we are naming our documents, I would recommend using your surname. We want to keep it slightly formal. The document type, and it's going to be saved as a PDF. So this is the name that I would use for my resume if I was submitting it to an employer. I would call it West Resume PDF. Couple of reasons. 1, I want them to know who the document is about. 2, I want them to know what type of document it is. If we are uploading this to their web portal or to their website, the name of the document isn't going to matter a ton. They're going to find it under our profile. However, if they are downloading this document, saving it to their downloads folder or to a resume folder, putting our surname or family name first is going to group different documents together. So instead of cover letter starting with C being at the top of their folder and resume starting with R being at the bottom of their folder, both of these documents are going to get grouped right next to each other based on my last name. And if I send a reference page, that's going to end up right in between them. So it's going to be easy to find my documents, and they're going to know which one it is. So they'll say, oh, I wanted to check out their cover letter. Okay, well, go in, find it. Oh, that's the document. Perfect. Makes it easy. You can include job title. So for example, when I was applying for a job here at Regina Open Door, there were 2 positions I applied for actually. And so I included a keyword. It was an instructor position, so I included the keyword instructor. in my title. We don't want this to get too long. We want it to be easy to read. We don't want it to be too complicated. So keep it as simple and short as you can. But this would be absolutely fine. Gonna make it easy. And when I'm applying for multiple jobs with the same employer, I'm gonna have a different cover letter and different resume, maybe even different references for those two jobs because I'm highlighting different skills. I'm gonna be using different skills. So I'm gonna be talking about different things on both of those resumes. And so for that reason, we might make sure that we're differentiating between those two. What we want to do and make sure that we're not sending them our master document, right? The one that says we've all got this document somewhere on our computer. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're more organized than me, where we've got like 30 different versions of it. Be careful. Double check, triple check. Make sure you're sending the correct one. We don't want this name to get too long. I talk about this in our job search workshop, but keeping your documents organized can be very, very helpful and can make this process a lot simpler and easier for you. So what I do is every time I apply for a job, I will create a folder on my computer where I will put the job posting, the cover letter I wrote, the resume I wrote, the references I'm using, and then I will save the PDFs of each of those to the same folder, and I will send the employer the PDFs. We talk about making adjustments or updating our resume for every job we're applying for. We're targeting it, and that seems like a lot of work, and it is the first time. But every time you create a new resume for a job, you are creating a new starting point that you can use when you find a similar job. So I created an instructor resume for this position. The next time I see an instructor or facilitator job, I'm not going to go to my master resume. I'm going to go to this one. This is going to be closer and more targeted to the job I'm applying for, and I'm creating a new starting point. So instead of editing my original resume over and over again, I start closer and closer to my finished product. And by the time you've applied for a dozen jobs, you're going to have a dozen different starting points. And this targeting, this adjustment is going to take less and less time each time. To the point where you might say, oh, you know what? I have a resume for that one already. I'll change a couple keywords, make sure this should go back up to the top. This can come down, and we're good to go. And it goes from taking an hour to taking 5 or 10 minutes. They're going to be text files, so they're not going to take up a lot of space. So save every resume you make, but make sure you're labeling those original documents clearly with the job posting so that you know what you used it for. But if you keep it organized, it can make your life a lot simpler and easier. We're going to send them PDFs because this is going to, not technically, but it's going to freeze that document exactly the way it looks on our screen. It's going to look exactly the same way when the employer opens it. Unlike a Word document, which is going to substitute fonts, because it can still be edited, it's going to move things around. PDFs are ideal. An employer may request a specific file type, and if they do, we're going to provide it in that file type. And I would go out of my way to make sure that that document uses as many default settings as possible so that it won't adjust. When they open it, it's going to look the same. Probably the biggest one is just making sure you're using a default font that most computers are going to have, something like Calibri. I will say if they request a specific file type, it could be that the person is kind of picky, or it could be that they use an applicant tracking system that works best with that type of file. And if they ever ask you to copy and paste your resume into a text box, they're using an applicant tracking system. Some applicant tracking systems, it's not so much an issue anymore. It used to be a bigger one. Didn't play well with PDFs. If you want to know if your PDF can be scanned for text, open it, select all the text, paste it into Notepad or WordPad, and if all of the words will show up, the formatting will be gone. But if all the words show up, it should be able to find that information. It's just looking for strings of characters. So because it's looking for strings of characters, it doesn't matter if it's bold or italics. It just matters if those characters, those letters are in the same line or in that order. Questions?
I have a question, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
Regarding the text, when we are writing the text, for example, if it is for the professional experience or maybe education, if, for example, we are doing for a task, for example, analyze and exam, or for example, materials or whatever, or drawings. and, for example, can we write, or is it better to write and A and E, or just put the symbol and, or maybe like put just a slash between them? Is it correct, or maybe because the issue is the screening later? Is it for the system? Is it better for us to write it by letter, or put a symbol, or as I said, slash or dash or whatever?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there is, and I can't remember it. I think there is like a technically correct time to use and a technically correct time to use the ampersand. I don't remember what they are, and if anybody does, congratulations. I would say one challenge is being consistent. We don't want to sometimes be using ampersands and sometimes be using and. I would trend towards using and. It would be more common. I'm trying to remember, what is it? Is it when we're grouping things that go together, we use ampersands, and when we're making ordered lists, or I can't remember. It doesn't really matter. I would probably use and whenever possible. 100%. I have seen, right? I have 100% seen people do this and put it in. Or one thing I would say is look at often this is happening in a bullet, right? So look at your bullet and ask yourself, if I was the person reading this, let's say I'm reading it aloud in my head, right? Ask yourself which flows better. And I would say for the most part, it's going to be rare that this is going to change line length. So there is a possibility that this, with a bunch of other information, pushes this to 2 lines of the bullet, while this is 1 line. Mm-hmm. But as a general rule, I default to and. There are situations where I might make an adjustment. I don't think it's going to be a deal breaker. I don't think an employer is going to be like, oh, they use and or they use ampersand. So if you have a preference, it probably doesn't matter. If your job is to know the difference between when to use and when to use ampersand, then I would make sure you do it correctly. This is one of those examples where, similarly, like earlier I was mentioning, like, let's avoid color, let's keep it simple, not too complicated. Mm-hmm. If I was applying to be a graphic designer, though, I might say, well, let's add some color. Let's add what am I trying to demonstrate as well, right? So it depends on what your job is. In some cases, if I'm a proofreader or a copy editor, I'm going to make sure I'm using them correctly. For you and me, it may not make as much of a difference.
Yes, and for example, in the case one, I want to have like one task in 1 line. So in this case, maybe putting the slash give me more space to write something else. So, but still, it's correct.
I would say most employers would look at this and recognize this is a this is kind of going to give an and or situation. Analyze and or assess. Blah blah blah. They're going to see that these are 2 skills, and the tracking software, like the applicant tracking software, they're going to pick up this word and they're going to pick up this one, and they're not going to care that there's no space or that there's a slash there. So it should be fine for that purpose.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, good question. Any other questions from anybody else? Again, it may seem like we're being overly detailed, but these are little things that I can take care of as the applicant in advance. I don't want the employer to think about this at all. I don't want them to notice, oh, did he do this? Did he do that? I want them to just encounter my resume, learn about me, and not really think about it at all. I want it to feel easy. I want it to feel comfortable, and I want them to go, yeah, now I know about this person. They may not know why it was so easy to learn about me, but they're going to hopefully get that feeling or that impression. They're going to say, yeah, it was easy to identify why Dale's a good candidate for this role. So I'm taking care of all those little details so the employer doesn't even notice. Because there are going to be some employers who are going to notice little things here and there. And especially if we're not paying close attention. I'll give you an example. I remember being shown a cover letter. This is a few years ago. But I was shown a cover letter. It was 1 page. Each paragraph used a different font. It became pretty clear as I was reading it that the person had pulled paragraphs from other cover letters that they had written in the past. So they applied for this job, they applied for this one, and then they grabbed those paragraphs, put them in. And they had 4 or 5 paragraphs. Each one was in a different font. That's all I remember. I don't remember the job. I don't remember what they could do. I don't remember their name. All I remember is that, wow, this cover letter looks disorganized. This cover letter looks like someone rushed and just slapped information in, saved it, and sent it. That's not the impression we want to create. So a little bit of attention to detail, and let's hope that the information we're sharing is the thing that's memorable, not our formatting decisions. All right. How many role and responsibility bullet points should we be including for a job title? Classic Dale answer, it depends. One thing I would say is the level of detail that we want to include, I would say 4 or 5 bullets for an entry, whether that's a job, whether that's something else, whether that's a skills section, is going to probably be the right amount of detail. It will depend on how many jobs we've had. If we've had one job, but it was 15 years and we did a number of different tasks, once we get past more than 4 or 5 bullet points, I'm starting to think about subheadings. I'm starting to think about organizing those bullets. What we don't want, and I'll give you an example here. Let me jump into my thing here. Let's go down here to Andrew's example here now. I'm going to do this quickly as an example. We wouldn't necessarily do it this way. But what you might notice here is, whoa, I just about spilled coffee everywhere. Everything's fine. I'm okay. Could have been a disaster. Probably would have been fine. At this point, this still feels pretty readable, right? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 bullets. I will tell you 6 bullets, probably fine. We start to add more than that, and this starts to feel like a big wall of text. Now we're at 12 bullets and a lot of information. What happened here? Let's see. Did that work properly? No. All right, let's do this. There we go. And it starts to feel pretty overwhelming. We add some more, and this starts to feel like a wall of text. As an employer, this starts to get difficult to consume and to read because I don't know, there's not enough context for the information. So I'm just moving from one piece of data to the next with no organization. Ideally, at this point, I would change this to subheadings. I would have a subheading, responsibilities or duties, achievements and accomplishments, something to break it up and to give it some context. Otherwise, it's just stream of consciousness. And it becomes similar to like if you were reading a book and there were no paragraphs, it was just wall of text. Those paragraphs are there to help us understand that new information is coming or this information goes together. And it also helps us rest in between information. Makes it easier for us to consume that information and to scan. And one thing that I think is really valuable about any document like this, especially things like resumes, technical documents, they are not the most exciting, right? Like if you were having difficulty sleeping, I would say, here's a stack of resumes. Read those when you're having difficulty falling asleep. You'll sleep like a baby. They don't sleep all that well. You'll sleep like a person who sleeps very well. They're not the most exciting thing in the world, even if our lives that they're describing are pretty exciting. It's nothing personal. It's just the nature of these kinds of documents. So we want to break them up and we want it to be scannable. So for example here, if I'm an employer and I'm looking at these 2 documents and at a glance, I'm like, okay, they've got some professional experience, education. Okay, there's some volunteer down there. What were they doing? Well, they were an auditor, then they were a manager in audits. Oh, they were a senior accountant. Okay, what were they doing? Every time I look, I can go to another level of formatting, another heading, and learn a little bit more. In a skills section, I might say, well, I've got these customer service skills and these administrative skills and these office skills, and it's going to give them some sense of what I can do, no matter how much time they have to spend on my resume, whether it's 10 seconds or 10 minutes. So I like to break it up into sections so it's easier for them to consume. Even if they don't read my bullets, they'll see the heading for those bullets and they'll know I understand a component of the job. So how much time do they have? I don't know. So let's give it some context. If you just have a wall of text, it's going to be hard to consume. And like, think about this resume here. Does this look like something you want to spend your afternoon reading? It's trickier, right? A little bit more difficult. Granted, these are repeating, but I think the aesthetic, you can appreciate what's going on there. So I would say 3 to 5 bullets. I would try to have at least 3 bullets for every entry that I have in my work experience or in a skills section. Not the case for education and things like that, but for a section like work experience or a skills section, and we'll talk about this in just a minute, I want to have at least 3 bullets for every section, but I would want to have 5 to 6 is going to be ideal, 4 to 6 even. And it will depend on how many jobs I'm listing. So if I'm listing, let's say, 4 or 5 jobs in the last 10 years, I'm going to have fewer bullets per job. If I've got 2 jobs over the last 10 years, I might have a couple extras. I might extend it to 7. Even then, I would. Do I want to separate those into headings? We want it to not only be easy to read, we want it to look easy to read, so that employer will take the time. So it's a great question.
I have another question, please.
Yeah, go ahead.
For each bullet, so the starting verb should, because I noticed when you put a zoom in, I saw that all verbs are in past. So I have to put for every task my starting verb in past, or maybe I can use like instead of saved the company a budget of, I can say saving with the same ing.
Yeah.
Or what do you recommend?
First thing. The most important thing is to be consistent. So if you're going from past to present tense within the same block of bullets, that would be worse than choosing one and staying with it. Yes. As a general rule, I would suggest, definitely being consistent with it is the most important. In a skills section, I might be more likely to use present tense, or a current job. If it's a job that I did and I've already left, I'm more likely to use past tense because it happened, but it is not currently happening. So in a skills section, one of the reasons I might be more likely to use present tense is I'm trying to help the employer understand how I will use those in their workplace. So it would depend. I don't think it. Some people will say it makes a big difference. I think the consistency makes a big difference, especially when they're right next to each other and they're in different tenses. It feels weird to people reading it. But there's going to be times where it'll be easier to write in past tense than in present for certain kinds of jobs. I just want it to I want it to flow and feel comfortable for an employer. So I don't think it's as important, which it is. One thing you'll notice is that the job posting typically won't be in past tense, right? It's going to be in present tense, for example. And so when we're trying to match keywords, it is easier to match keywords in present tense. They're going to be a closer match. So, for example, the employer might say, well, we want you to analyze these texts. And you say, well, I analyzed texts in my previous, or analyze schematics, let's say. And then, in my previous role, I analyzed schematics. In this case, we've got the root word, we've got the full word. It's not going to make a huge difference, but there are times where it does impact how closely we can match the keyword. And if we're only pulling a section of it, it'll depend on what, which words the employer and how they are screening for them. So, could have an impact.
Thank you.
Great question. I like the questions. They get me thinking about. Sometimes I get questions that I don't get asked very often. That one actually doesn't come up very often. So then I have to be like, wow, good question. What do we do? And sometimes I forget to talk about things I meant to talk about, and then people remind me. So makes my day more interesting, even if. Okay. Any other questions while I get our next screens queued up here? This next part here is going to be fairly important for us because we are going to take a look now at resume types. And this is probably one of the most important topics we'll discuss this week. When we're thinking about emphasis, one way that we think about it is what we want to prioritize for the employer, but there are also times where we want to de-emphasize things. So we want to shift attention away from something. It will always depend on the job we are applying for. You'll see 3 resume styles or types on the screen right now. Every person in this workshop, while applying for jobs, could end up using a chronological for one job, a functional for a different one, and a hybrid or combination for even another job. So you are not, when people say, well, which one should I use, Dale? Depends on the job you are applying for. Each of these resume styles emphasizes different things and is useful for drawing attention to certain parts of our work history or our experience and drawing attention away from other parts. If you only have one resume, if you've only made one resume in your life, 99% of the time it is the chronological resume. Chrono meaning time. The chronological resume is a classic. In fact, there was a time where this was the only resume that people made, organized by time in reverse chronological order. So the most recent experience at the top, and as we read down the page, we travel back in time. But here's the thing, a resume is not a time machine. We can't change who we are or our experiences. So sometimes our resume makes us look overqualified. Sometimes our resume can make us look like not a good fit, like all our experiences in a different area. And so the chronological resume is a great choice when the job you are applying for is the same as the jobs you have been doing. So you've been a teacher for 20 years and you're applying to be a teacher. Chronological resume is going to emphasize your relevant work history. Great choice. You've been an accountant for 20 years, 10 years, even 5 years, and you're applying to be an accountant. The chronological resume is going to emphasize your relevant work experience. Great choice. You've been a software developer for 10 years. You're applying to be a merchandiser in a grocery store, stocking shelves for a survival job. Your chronological resume is going to emphasize your experience as a software developer, and you are going to look like not a good fit. The chronological resume is great when your work history matches the job you're applying for, but it's not a great fit when it doesn't. So this is the challenge we run into. What do we do when our work history doesn't match? When we aren't a great choice, or when our skills and abilities, maybe they're transferable, we'll talk about what that means, but our work history doesn't look good. The chronological resume emphasizes your work history. So if it's not a good match, it's going to show that you are not a good match. It's going to prove that you are not a good match. And that's a challenge. So what do we do when we want to apply for a job and we're not necessarily a great match for that job based on our work history? Well, what we do is we use a functional resume, and the functional resume focuses on relevant skills and abilities. So we're not focused on the job title we had, we're focused on the skills we will use in the new workplace. I'm going to show you examples of each of those. One second here. The functional resume, what you're going to notice, sorry, 1 second. Got some boxes on my screen. Okay, there we go. What you're going to notice is that the bullets are no longer organized under job titles. They're organized under skill headings. So what we're really doing when we change resume types is we're moving where the details are. We're moving where the bullets appear. We're giving those bullets new context. Context that hopefully makes us appear to be the best candidate we can be, a stronger candidate. Doesn't mean we'll be a perfect candidate. That might not even exist. But our goal is to make ourselves the strongest candidate we can be. Chronological, great when the job you're applying for is like the jobs you've done in the past. Functional resume is more effective when the job you're applying for is different than the work you've done in the past. And the hybrid or combination, well, the name describes what it does. It is a hybrid or a combination of the chronological and the functional. So we get the work experience with bullets of a chronological, but we also get the skills section of a functional that also has bullets. This emphasizes skills and work history. Now you might say, Dale, I don't have the work history and I don't have the skills and abilities for this job. I don't have anything transferable. That might be an issue with our job search. This job might not be a good fit for us. We might want to look in a different area. Not every job is going to be the right job for us. But if you have transferable skills, if you can step into that role and do it, but your experience is in a different industry or area, the functional can be a good option. The hybrid combination usually gets used when someone, well, we'll talk about it when we get there. Let's take a look at a chronological first. Let's not get in too deep. Here we go. This is what it looks like. In fact, you've seen this one already because I was sharing it with you earlier. In this case, for a chronological resume, the emphasis is on work history or work experience. So how do we identify a chronological resume? We look for the bullets. Here they are. It's typically going to be the largest section. So here's our bullets. And how are those bullets organized? They are organized by job title. So we know that we are sharing this information in the context of the job that we did before. That tells us it's chronological. It's being organized by work experience or work history. We're saying, hey, here's the heading for these bullets. The heading is my job title, the work that I was doing. If you're applying for that entry-level position and this is a manager role, it's not going to be a very good match. That job title is going to make you look overqualified because you probably are. But here's the thing. If you are applying for that similar type job, it's going to show, hey, not only do I have these skills and abilities in the bullets, but I use them in the same context. what a great match, what a great fit I am. Now, there was a time 20 years ago, before the job search went online, before we had a little bit more flexibility, chronological resumes were all we had. And I can remember the first jobs I was applying for, I made one resume. I printed out 50 copies and I walked around town, dropped them off. Different businesses walked in, hey, I'm looking for... That's not how work tends to go these days, but the chronological can still be a good choice for us if our work experience matches the job we're applying for. So where are the bullets? Which is the largest section? That will typically tell you whether it's a chronological, functional, or a combination hybrid. If they're organized by job title, hey, they're looking at a chronological resume. Now, I've got an example that I want to share with you. So let's jump into my folder here. Here is a chronological resume. We were just looking at this, in fact. This is exactly what we saw on the screen. I'm going to scroll down. Here's Andrew's resume. Now, our heading could be work experience, could be professional experience, could be, again, we see people use different terms for these sections, but regardless of what specific heading he's using, they're organized by job title. And so this is a chronological resume. One thing that I'll point out here, and this is just a formatting bonus for you. As a general rule, which I say all the time, I like to align my dates on the right-hand side, particularly once we get further down the page and we get into things like education, volunteering. Again, I fit this onto one page so you could see it all at once, but this could easily be a 2-page document. I just wanted you to be able to kind of take the whole thing in. In this context, we often don't have bullets under education and things like that. And so when we don't, oops, that's not what I want. So when we get further down the page and we end up with our dates not aligned on the right-hand side, we can end up with a document that looks like this. And what you'll notice here, I can make this work, is we end up with kind of this awkward imbalance thing where the page kind of swoops in and we end up with this negative space over here, or white space on the right-hand side. Negative or white space isn't bad. For example, the negative space here draws our eye back over to this heading. The negative space here draws our eye back to this side here. So it can help us refocus, know where information starts and ends. But in this case, it makes the page feel kind of imbalanced. At least I would argue it does, if I can jump back here. And it feels like if we held it, it would kind of dangle at an angle. When we include the dates on the right-hand side, you'll see it kind of squares the document up, makes it feel more balanced. So if you find that your document kind of looks like that, this is a nice way to adjust for it. You don't have to, but it can work pretty well. And it's a pretty typical formatting style. As a general rule, man, I'm saying general rule a lot today, but that's okay. I like to use tab stops to take them over to the far margin. If you just use tabs, it doesn't always, they can be difficult to line up. And if you use spaces, it's even harder. If you don't know how to use tab stops, I'll probably end up showing it at some point in time this week. So stay tuned for that. But putting our dates on the right-hand side, as long as they line up neatly, can be a nice way to balance our page. So he's got 2 or 3 entries here. He could absolutely have some bullets under this heading here. I just wanted to make sure everything fit on a page. He's going to have his education, volunteer. He probably has some credentials or certifications in training that he could add, and easily this could go to 2 pages. And he's got his name. You'll notice here at the top as well, Andrew's got his CPA designation listed. It makes sense in this context because it's going to be relevant for the jobs he's applying for. If he was applying for a survival job or an entry-level position, he would probably remove that. He would also probably not use a chronological resume. So if you've only got one resume, it's probably chronological. And when you apply for survival jobs or transition jobs, you probably go, this is frustrating. I look super overqualified with 15 years of experience in a professional situation and all of that. So not always a great fit, but in many cases it is a good choice for us. We've always got it as an option. Questions about the chronological? There we go. All right. Now, we are applying for that survival job, or we're applying for a job where the skills that we bring, we've got those, but the work experience the context doesn't help us. So we want to emphasize the skills instead. Functional resume can be a really good option for us. On a functional resume, the emphasis is on the skills and abilities that we're using. instead of on the job title where we use those skills and abilities. So instead of where we did it, we're focused on what we do. Make sense? We're going to have 2 or 3 skill headings. As a general rule, if you only list the skills in just a bulleted list with no heading, it's a little bit like what I was showing you before, where it's like, I don't have any context for it. So now I have to read each bullet in order to understand the full scope of your skills and abilities. It gets kind of annoying to a lot of employers. So you want to break it into 2 or 3 sections. If you break it into like 4 or 5 skill sections, at that point, it's probably way too detailed and you're getting too specific. 2 or 3 feels right. It just feels right. Why? I don't know. People rule of thirds. People like it. People like groups of 3. There's probably a psychological reason for it, but that's not my area of expertise. If you are a psychologist, you can tell me why people like groups of 3 so much, but they do. They appear everywhere. We see them all the time on job search tools and things like that. The emphasis is on skills and abilities. So is it a functional resume? I don't know. Where are the bullets? Well, the bullets are here. And how are they organized? They are organized by the skill they represent. Now, we're not going to write major skill. We're going to replace the words major skill with a heading that describes these skills. So if I'm applying for a customer service job, I might have a skill heading that says customer service, and I'm going to have bullets. Now, here's the thing. I might not have done a job that was called customer service. I might be an employment readiness instructor applying for a customer service job, but I interact with customers, participants in my workshop, clients all the time. And a lot of the ways that I interact and communicate look a lot like customer service. Active listening, providing alternative solutions, identifying products and services that will benefit my clients and recommending them. It's going to look a lot like customer service. So I'm going to talk about that, but I'm going to recontextualize it, not under the job title employment readiness instructor. No one in customer service wants to hire an employment readiness instructor, but they do want to hire someone with customer service skills. It just so happens that I got those, or I use them while working as an employment readiness instructor. So instead of what I was instead of who I was or what my job title was, I'm talking about what I did, not where I did it or the context. So I'm giving it new context. We're still including our work history because what makes work history relevant is not just the job we had, but the fact that we were employed. Oh, someone will take a risk and hire you and then keep you as an employee. That's relevant to an employer. Even if the job we were doing isn't, your employability is. So we still need our work history here, but the details aren't as important. So we're going to group them a little bit differently. We're going to de-emphasize them. I don't want the employer focused on the job I had. I want them focused on the skills I used in that job, especially the ones that were relevant to the job I'm applying for. So in this case, what we're really doing is we're just moving the bullets and we're giving them a new heading. That's really all we're doing. In fact, I have a slide that I want to show you. Here's a chronological resume on the left, and here is a functional resume on the right. At a glance, they are almost indistinguishable. You wouldn't even notice unless I pointed it out if you were just glancing at them. This is why a functional resume can be effective. It looks like a resume. It looks like a traditional resume. What we've done is we've reorganized where the bullets go. We've given them new context so that the employer learns about us in a different way. So at a glance, they look the same. In fact, we might not even rewrite the bullets all that much. What we're trying to do is say, hey, here's some good reasons to hire me, and I want the employer to see them before they get to my work history where I look overqualified. So does it solve all of our problems? No, we might still be overqualified. Our experience might be in another place. Our goal is to give them good reasons to call us for an interview before they get there. So by the time they get there, they say, well, you know what? They seem pretty qualified. I'll call them for an interview. If they're not a good fit, I'll find out then. I'm willing to take a chance or take a risk there. And really what we're always trying to do is overcome that employer's sort of sense of risk or risk management. They want to save money by hiring the correct person. They want to save time by not having to retrain another person later on. And a new person who doesn't seem like a good fit is a risk. It's why employers like internal candidates, and it's why they have the screening process. They're trying to reduce the risk that they're taking. So we try to give them the confidence that we're the right fit. Here's that functional resume I was showing you. Let's take a look, though, at what happens when we put some of that information in. So here's Jen's resume. I'm going to send you all of these PDFs, by the way, so you can use them to help inform your choices. We don't always have a career summary on a functional resume, often because we're trying to de-emphasize the career. It's going to depend on the situation. We might have an objective, but there are times where we might include one. This, for Jen here, is not a bad example. So I leave it in so you see where it would go. and how it might be organized. But regardless, the bullets that we're encountering or we're finding, especially near the top here, they're not organized by job title, but by the tasks or the work that we're doing. So here, Jen is emphasizing administration and sales as her two key skills that she's bringing to this new job. Now, why is Jen using a functional resume? Well, she's got work history, but this work history is in a bunch of different industries. She's working for a corporation here, a sporting goods store, a hotel, so retail, hospitality, a TV station. Now she's working in media, and Marlin Travel. So now she's working in hospitality and at a travel agency. So she's in a bunch of different industries. She doesn't want to focus on the fact that she's changing industries all the time. She wants to focus on the skills that she's bringing to that new job, emphasizing the administration and the sales components. And one of the reasons that she might use the functional resume here is that her sales experience is actually over a decade ago. It's a long time ago. The nice thing about a functional resume is it decontextualizes when this happened as well. So now she can talk about her sales experience like it happened yesterday, even though it was over a decade ago. She's taken the context away or de-emphasized it. It's still down here if they wanted to find it. But as an example, as a sales agent, successfully persuaded airline representatives to clear space on overbooked flights and make special arrangements for clients. So going above and beyond, demonstrating persuasiveness and some sales techniques, she's giving us some good skills for a person who works in sales. If she was using a chronological resume, all of these bullets would be located under these different job titles. And we'd probably have 3 to 5 bullets for every one of these jobs. Let's make it 4. Let's say there's 4 bullets for each of these jobs. She's got 1, 2, 3, 4 jobs before she ever gets to the sales agent position. Currently, this is her 4th bullet. On a chronological resume, this would have to be at least her 17th bullet. If there were 5 bullets for each of these, it might be her 21st bullet. Because she would have to list these in reverse chronological order under her work history, this bullet is near the bottom of her page, probably on page 2. Right now, in the skills section, it's the 4th one. And if she thought the sales experience was more important than the admin, she could list sales before admin, and it would be her 1st bullet. So we have a lot more flexibility in how we share this information with an employer because we're not tied to the chronological anymore, to the chronology of our experience. We're not organizing it by time. We're organizing it by relevance and emphasis. Okay, so now I get to decide what I think is most important and put it first. We do not have to list our skills alphabetically or by time. We list them by relevance. So what's most important? Put it first. This is a level of flexibility that we really appreciate and enjoy. It gives us a lot more flexibility in how we present ourselves to an employer. She's still got to share her work history, but you'll notice she's not emphasizing it. When you look at this document, where is your eye drawn? My guess is to the bullets. You probably start reading those. You may not have even read most of the job postings or most of the job titles here. What she's doing here, she's saying, yes, I was employed, I was working, don't worry about it. Here's what I can do for you. Now, the employer can always go down here, take a look, decide, oh, yeah, that's relevant. She's moving around a lot. I don't know. There might be a stronger candidate. Her goal is to get the person to think, hey, you know what? I'm going to call this person for an interview before they get to here. We're trying to overcome that barrier. Like I said, it's not a time machine. We can't go change who we are or what our experiences are, but we can emphasize the ones that make us a good candidate, and we can de-emphasize the ones that make us look like less of a good candidate. And cross our fingers and hope the employer will take a chance on us. So it's not perfect. And you will hear people say, well, when an employer sees a functional resume, they go, is this person overqualified? Is their experience somewhere else? They might. But your alternative is to use a chronological resume where we prove that we're overqualified, where we prove that all of our experience is somewhere else. So we're trying to find a balance there that's going to help us be successful. Questions about the functional resume? I'll cue us up here for our final one. Our final resume type is the combination hybrid. So all those things we said about the chronological resume are true for the combination. And all the things we said about the functional resume are also true for the combination. We're putting them together. The challenge with the combination is deciding where the bullets or which bullets are going to go. We're going to have a skills section, and we're going to have a work experience section, and we're going to put bullets in both. So how do we decide where each bullet goes? And this is the challenge of the combination. These are typically going to be 2-pagers because we're including details and information in the skills section and in the professional experience section. So sometimes the question is, why would I use a combination hybrid resume if my experience is relevant? Wouldn't I just use a chronological? Good question. If you're asking yourself that, there's a couple of reasons. Sometimes we want to emphasize specific skills. So maybe this job calls for certain kinds of skills and, hey, I've got those. I really want to draw attention to it, but I also have relevant work experience and I want them to recognize that. Sometimes our resume looks a little bit like Jen's resume. Our work experience is relevant, but we moved into a new labor market and our skills and abilities that we're using happened 5 or 10 years ago. We're stepping into a more entry-level role in our industry instead of the role that we were in when we left our last labor market, right? So for example, someone's working in management in their home country, they leave. Well, we're not going to step into a management role. We might be down 1 or 2 levels within that industry. We have relevant work experience, but it's 5 or 10 years ago. So when we use a chronological resume, that experience is further down our page, maybe even on our second page. And it's not the first thing the employer sees. So what we do is we create a combination hybrid. This allows us to list the skills we will be using in that job at the at the top, emphasizing that, but our work experience is still relevant. It has to be in reverse chronological. We're going to include information down here too. Another time we might use this resume style is if we have done the same job for a number of different employers and we find ourselves repeating ourselves in each job title. So, I did the same thing in this job title, I did the same thing in this job. We can create a skills section where we describe those things one time, and then we can list things that were unique to the job under the job title. That helps us reduce redundancy or repetition. Lastly, sometimes the skills and abilities you have are a good match for the job. So is your work experience, but the story of your work history seems cluttered or disorganized. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. When I was applying to work in employment readiness at Regina Open Door Society, my work history included teaching roles and supported employment roles. So sometimes I'm working in the labor market, working with people, helping them find employment and maintain employment. Sometimes I'm in the classroom teaching, different topics, different subjects. If I just use a chronological resume, it looks like I'm doing a bunch of random stuff, but there's no connection. When I create my skills section, I can use the headings to create that connection. I say, well, here's my facilitation skills. Here's my experience in the labor market. And here's my office admin skills. I've got 3 subject headings, and then I've got employment that supports each of those claims. My work is relevant, but it doesn't look as organized if I just list it by job title. Once I can put it into a skills section, it becomes much more organized and much more understandable. Oh, he's got all 3 of those aspects that we need. He's teaching, but he's teaching about the labor market. He's teaching employment readiness skills. Those 2 are going to go together, and he's doing it in an office space. So he needs to know how to use a photocopier and write reports and do things like that. I let the skills section tell the story, organize my ideas and thoughts, and then my work history support those by giving additional information or things that were unique about that job. So there are lots of times where a combination or hybrid resume can be a really good choice for us. It depends on what we want to show the employer. I'm going to give you an example here in just a second, but before I do, I just want to come back here for 1 second. Chronological, our work history is a good match. Functional, our skills are a good match, but our work history isn't. Hybrid and combination, our work history is a good match and our skills are a good match. This is when we want to use these different ones. So you're applying for a survival job, you're probably using a functional resume. You're applying for the same job you had in the past, you're probably using a chronological. You're applying for a job similar to work you've done in the past, but it's a slightly different role or a role you did a few years ago, hybrid combination. You're a perfect candidate for the role and you want to emphasize that, hybrid combination. All right, let's look at an example here before we go for our break. I'm going to pull up the combination hybrid here. This is what we were looking at before. This is a tricky one to fit onto one page. He could absolutely have some training, some volunteer experience, but it's tough to fit it in. So here we go. Robert McIntyre, he's got his relevant skills listed here as programming and app development, leadership, and business management. And in his most recent work experience, he was working as an IT manager. Before that, he was working as a senior IT specialist. But that is 10 years ago. So this tells me, I'm thinking maybe Robert's stepping into a new labor market, doesn't have a lot of experience in this environment or in this area. he has a lot of experience in the job, but it was a few years ago. And when I look at his skills section, I notice that the programming and app development is listed first, not the leadership or business management. This tells me that this new job is more focused on this aspect of the job. And so he wants to emphasize those skills ahead of the leadership and business management. Those are still relevant, but they're not his primary role. And if he used a chronological resume, it would look like those are his primary. So this allows him to emphasize this job ahead of the more recent job, but they're both still relevant. And this is giving him the opportunity to be a little bit more flexible in how he shares those skills, sharing the most relevant ones with the employer first. Questions?
I think all is clear till now. Everybody is getting it. So,
I love it.
Yeah.
All right. Then what we'll do now is we'll take a break, and when we come back, we're going to start talking about some of the ways that we are going to write, for example, these entries. We've started talking about how we present these entries on the document. We're starting to see them. This is how we're organizing information. But what information do employers want, and how do we make choices about it? That's what we're going to come back and discuss. So I'm going to put a timer on the screen here. Give me 1 second to, oops, that's fun. Put that up. I'm going to give you 15. And when we come back, oops, here we go. We'll take a look at our new or next topic. Welcome back. Now we emphasize the importance of these different resume styles because they're one of the primary ways that we change the emphasis of our resume. And they give us some flexibility in how we share that information with employers. With that being said, there's some other elements that go into our resume that we want to talk about as well. And one of those is how we represent our experiences. We know we can have a skills section where we can include, headings for those different skills. But even within our work experience, there's certain information that we want to share with the employer that helps us represent our experiences to them. And my guess is you've been writing entries in your work experience, in your education, under your volunteer, or even training. And this is another opportunity for us to be consistent. When an employer gets to a new section, whether they move from our work experience to our education or into our certifications or even our volunteer experiences, the way that they encounter or the way that they see that information is going to help them understand what we were doing. There's 4 pieces of information that we need to be sharing with every work experience that we're mentioning. And I would say typically with every piece with every entry that we're putting on our resume. Those 4 things are what we were doing, when we were doing it, who we were doing that work with, this would be our employer or organization, and where it was happening. And there's some reasons for this. What we were doing, this is often going to be things like the job title, the degree we got, the certification we received, even how we were volunteering. When we were doing it is also going to be relevant. You can think to your job, think about how the work that you have done has changed over the last 5 or 10 years. Think of the way that technology is impacting the work that you do. And recognize that, well, some parts of the job have changed, probably since you first started in that industry or doing that work. It'll depend on your amount of experience, of course. But if someone got, for example, worked in, let's say, information security 20 years ago, well, a lot has changed since that time. So when it happened, it matters. Our most recent experience is our most up-to-date experience. Who we were doing that work with also is important. The employer, the organization, the company. This helps provide additional context. I've worked in employment services for a couple of different organizations. Who that organization was or who my employer was changes the populations, the groups of people that I was working with. And in those cases, sometimes changes the kind of work that we're doing or what we're focused on in that work. And then where we were doing that work is also going to be something we want to share with an employer. The physical location can affect the regulations, the requirements for the industry, and the context. Now, here's what I will say. This can also create issues for us sometimes because where it happened can make employers question how it matches with Canadian experience. This is where it becomes very important that we have a good understanding of what our job or what the job we're looking for or we want looks like in a Canadian context. Being able to help an employer understand the similarities and the differences between the work that we did in one location and the work we did in another location or labor market, that self-awareness is going to help the employer feel much more comfortable offering us an opportunity. Now, I would also argue that these different areas or these different kinds of information, what we're doing, when we're doing it, who we're doing that with, and where, can also be organized by relevance and emphasis based on what is going to be the most convincing. And so in many situations, what we were doing or our job title is the most convincing or the most relevant piece of information. And I'll give you an example. If I listed my work, my job under my work experience, let me get my tool here. And I said, well, okay, so my work experience is with Regina Open Door Society. I'm in employment. That's not how that's spelled. Readiness. I should. No, that's fine. When someone looks at this as my entry on my resume, what they're going to see is Regina Open Door Society listed first. So at a glance, just skimming or scanning my resume, they're going to see Regina Open Door Society. I'm missing a word. Now, this creates a challenge. There's a lot of different kinds of jobs at Regina Open Door. There are employment readiness instructors. There are people who work in reception. There are employment counselors. There are team leads. There are supervisors. There are link instructors. There are accountants. There are HR professionals. There are communications professionals. There are designers. There are custodians. There are building managers. I think you see my point. By telling the employer where I work first, or who I work with, I should say, I'm actually not giving them a lot of information about what I can do. Now, maybe that's valuable. Maybe I actually don't want them to be thinking about my job title. Maybe I'm creating a functional resume, and listing my employer first is a better way to do it. It de-emphasizes my work history and my job title a little bit more. But for many of us, if we're providing a chronological or combination hybrid resume, the job title we had is the most relevant thing. Yes, I worked at Regina Open Door Society, but I worked there as an employment readiness instructor. So at a glance, if I list what I was doing first, this is going to be much more informative to an employer. Oh, he was an instructor teaching employment readiness skills. Okay, well, that tells me a lot about the kind of work he did. Workshops, training, one-on-one support. I get a lot more information about what Dale did than if I read Regina Open Door Society first. My employer is still relevant. This tells you that I work with newcomers to Canada or to Saskatchewan, and so it does give you context. It does change your understanding of the work that I do. But most importantly is the job title I had. It gives the most information. Now, when I did that work is also relevant. If I did this job 7 years ago, it was all in person all the time. The fact that I'm doing this job today tells you that I'm working in a hybrid model, that I've taught online. I've taught online exclusively for a couple of years. And now I teach in a hybrid model where some of our workshops are online and some of those workshops are in person. The fact that I did this job over the last 5 or 6 years makes a difference. It changes the skills and abilities I bring to that job in the context I taught in. I taught pre-pandemic, I taught during the pandemic, and I continue to teach. And for that reason, when I taught, which when did it start? Oh boy, I was thinking it's 2018 or 2017, something like that. We'll say 2017 because I don't remember. That's good, right? That's always good. Or I could also say to present. Now, where am I teaching matters as well. Who am I teaching? What is the labor market? What are the contexts? What are the regulations? The regulations and requirements for instructors, teachers, employment counselors are different in different environments. In fact, the regulatory requirements are different in Saskatchewan than they are in Alberta or BC. And so for that reason, where I was teaching also matters. These are the 4 key pieces of information I'm going to share with an employer. Now, you will notice that sometimes people will include other kinds of information like months, for example. So I might say, well, it was January 2017 to present. And if I was applying for a job outside of Canada, I would probably change this to Canada to give that context. so they know what the requirements were. But because I'm applying in Saskatchewan for jobs that are in Saskatchewan, and this experience was in Saskatchewan, I'm going to list the city and province. In fact, if I was applying for any job anywhere in Canada, I would list the city and province for that job. Now, there are going to be times here where we are going to be inconsistent, where we change the order, where we list Regina Open Door Society first and Employment Readiness Instructor down here, where I change this from Regina, Saskatchewan to Canada, or where I remove the month from my resume. And anytime I do that, I'm doing it for a reason, to emphasize something or to de-emphasize something. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we when we look at what we might call red flags or warning signs, things that an employer might be concerned or worried about. So, is my entry in my work experience going to look the same kinds of information, same formatting and structure as the entries in my education? Ideally, yes. Sometimes they might look different because I want to emphasize or de-emphasize something, but when possible, I'm going to list them in the exact same way. So let's take a look at some examples here so you can see what I mean. Oh, and I close that. Let's do this and this. So here are 4 different sections on my resume. You'll notice that I'm trying to be as consistent as possible with my headings. So all of my headings are bold, uppercase, and left aligned, and slightly larger. So each of my headings looks the same and they're all underlined, margin to margin. I'm trying to be consistent so that when an employer sees text that is bold, uppercase, underlined, and slightly larger, they know it is a different section. Now, when I get into my entries, you'll notice what I'm doing. Well, my job title here, it's bold, but it's not larger. It's not all caps. It's formatted the same as my entry here. So whatever my job title is going to be is going to look like this. Under my education, what I'm doing is not my job title anymore. It's the degree I got. So in this case, it's the Bachelor of Education. Under my additional training, it's not the degree or the job title I got. It's the course that I took or the training I received. And so I'm going to list the name as it appears on the certificate. And for my volunteer experience, this is where it gets a little tricky. It's not my job title anymore, but what I was doing is the role I had. So it depends on the situation. You might not have a title for volunteer. In this case, I was helping with homework, so I call it homework help. It's providing that at the Rainbow Youth Center. So each of those formatted in the same way, left aligned, bold, about the same size as all the other information. I'm making it stand out, but every time an employer sees bold, left aligned, first line of an entry, they know it's what I was doing. For my dates, you'll notice that right aligning them on the right-hand margin. I'm not including months, although I could. And that date is bold. So here, 2018 to 2020. Here, 2012. You'll notice for education and training, for education, there usually is a date range. Not so much for additional training, right? If you take a first aid certification or you go and learn about Microsoft databases or something, it's not necessarily going to take you multiple years, right? In some cases, this might take a weekend. Maybe it's a shorter course than that. So usually the date of completion is going to be the thing that matters. We want them to know what were the requirements on the date we completed the training. What were the requirements for a Bachelor of Education in 2012? Well, now the employer can find out. So they know when I completed this. For this additional training, they want to know what the requirements were at the time. For example, first aid and CPR training has been updated since 2020. But they also are going to want to know when this training expires, if it does, right? Something like a first aid and CPR certification will expire after 3 years and I'll need to be recertified. This tells them when that needs to happen. So if I listed it like this on my resume today, they would say, okay, well, he has completed first aid and CPR in the past, but he will need to recertify. But we're not worried that he won't be able to do it. He's done it in the past. Volunteer experience can be interesting. Sometimes it's an event that takes 1 day. Sometimes we might volunteer for multiple years. So this could be a date range, or it could be a year range, or it could be months. It'll depend on the situation. Now, I've also got my employer for my work experience. For my education, that's going to be the institution or the university. Here is the trainer or certifier as listed on the certificate. Who issued the certificate? That's who you want on your resume. In this case, St. John Ambulance, when I took this training. This training was provided by Primex, which was a workplace safety training organization, but their certifier had the St. John Ambulance instructor certification. So the certificate I got listed St. John Ambulance, even though the training was delivered by a different organization. What's on the certificate? That's what goes on your resume. And for my volunteer experience, what was the organization I was volunteering with? In this case, it was Rainbow Youth. You'll notice all of these experiences were in Regina. And so I'm going to list the city and the province. You notice I'm using italics so that you can tell the difference between the job title or the employer and the location. If I was working in Brazil, I would just write the country. I probably wouldn't include, the city or province if there was one. I would simply list the location. But because it's in Canada, I would list the city and province. Most employers are not geography majors, so mentioning that it was in Sao Paulo is not going to, be all that helpful to an employer. They will know probably the requirements or have a sense of the differences between those requirements and the Canadian requirement by knowing the country. If you want to be more specific, you can, but sometimes it gets difficult when we're listing a city, a province, and a country. And we're also including the employer. This can get really long and complicated. So it's a way of simplifying that experience. So we want to look for ways to be consistent, and there are times where we'll be less consistent. As we will see, sometimes we might remove the dates from our education. Sometimes we might include months or not include months. Sometimes we might list our employer first if we want to de-emphasize the job title we had. It will depend on the situation. And we saw some of these examples on our documents in our PDFs. Right, so here we've got Robert. He's sharing his job title. Then he's sharing the employer, the location, and the dates that he was working there. We saw on the functional resume a slightly different way of organizing it. Because we're de-emphasizing the work history, we saw the job title, the corporation, the location, and the date all on one line. Because our goal here is to show employability. Yes, we can get and maintain employment. What we were doing isn't as relevant, so we're not as worried about it being really clear or easy to read. But we might be interested, because this job requires administration skills, we would be a little bit more specific about our admin education because it is relevant. And on that chronological resume, we saw, for example, down here, consistency in the way that we were sharing that information across entries in the work experience, in the education, and here in the volunteer. Questions, concerns, thoughts?
Hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just write it down on a chat. Can we write down about the workshop we are taking? Like last night, I was taking the workshop about culture and communication, and the instructor said I can write it down in my resume that I had taken that workshop.
Yes. Is that that's with Ron?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if I was including that workshop, first of all, I will say when you're looking at any additional training and workshops and things like that, always ask yourself, does the employer care? Is this going to make me more employable? So I know you're not asking, but just for everyone's context, a workshop like the Workplace Culture and Communication workshop does have value because it shows the employer that we're taking the initiative, understanding the similarities and differences between different work environments. The resume workshop you're in right now, I would not put on my resume. It doesn't add any value, right? And so that's always a consideration. And we want to think about that for everything that we include on our resume under additional training or things like that. But for that one there, what I would do is I would list the. Let's go into. I'll go into this one here. 1 second. Cancel. What's going on? Where'd it go?
Because I'm making a resume for my sport worker, care worker.
Yeah.
So I asked him, so he said it's going to be beneficial for me.
I would agree. So then you'd have a heading that's like training and certifications, and then you're going to have that entry, which is workplace culture and communication, and this is going to be bolded. This is your heading. I don't know what your document is formatted to look like, but it might look like this. And then I might make this all caps. You might as well make it look pretty. And then you're going to have the date of completion there. The month or date isn't going to matter. The year is fine. I'm probably going to use a tab stop to put that. I would put this on the oil change. There we go. And then I'm going to include the organization that provided the training. We're trying to Open Door Society. And I think Ron would issue a certificate for that. So you could request that. And I'm probably going to remove the space after paragraph. And this is how I would organize it if I was putting it on my resume. Now, some people will have it organized in different ways. You might have dates in different places. That would be fine. But this is the way I would share that information. He might even, if it says workshop, I would actually put workshop there.
Yeah, thank you, Dale.
Yeah, no problem. Anytime you're filling out an entry like this as well, let's say you got it at rods, I would not put rods. I would spell it out. And if you are going to include the acronym later on, then I would put it in parentheses afterwards. I'll probably do it like that. Or I might simply exclude this. So it would depend on the. There you go. So yeah, this is how I would list that. I might do this left aligned. Yeah, something like I like that. Absolutely. Any other questions? Again, like I said, if you have a reason to be inconsistent in the way you're damaged or displaying this information, that's, I would say, honestly, typically fine. But if you display this information in a bunch of different ways on your resume and you're like, I don't know why I do it that way, that was the way the template I had was set up, I would consider making an adjustment so it's a little easier to read. Oops. All right. Now, one thing that we're going to find that's going to cause us to be inconsistent from time to time, and you'll notice we haven't talked about writing bullets yet. That's going to be tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to focus on writing our bullets, sharing those skills and abilities and experiences with employers, and how to do it in an effective way that matches the applicant tracking system and makes sense for the reader. So that's going to be tomorrow. But there are a couple other things that we want to think about before we get there. And red flags are warning signs. These are things that employers, when they see them on a resume, they get concerned. They get nervous. It makes them feel like the risk is bigger. They're not always legitimate concerns, but if an employer is concerned about it, whether it's legitimate or not, we might want to address it. These are some of the more common red flags that we'll see. And so I always like to talk about them at this point and stage in the workshop, in part because the way that we deal with this has a lot to do with how we include our entries. Okay. And so we've talked about, okay, once we're putting our entries in, we're putting those 4 pieces of information in. We're not limited to just those 4 pieces of information. We can add more context. And sometimes we might remove one of them. So I want to talk about it right now because these are some of the ways or some of the reasons that we might be inconsistent in the way we share information. Now, age is one that comes up all the time. And if you were here yesterday, you'll remember that we talked about the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code, and you might remember me mentioning that age is a prohibited ground, is a protected class. Employers are not supposed to use our age to decide who to hire, as long as we're over the age of 18. There are some outliers. For example, if you're working in a restaurant that serves alcohol, if you're a server, you need to be old enough to consume alcohol in order to serve alcohol. So you'd have to be 19. But as a general rule, 18 years of age or older, employers are not allowed to discriminate. The challenge we run into is that just because an employer isn't supposed to discriminate doesn't mean that they aren't consciously or subconsciously biased. And so there used to be, I would say, more of a bias or discrimination towards age for a couple of different reasons. One, if you're young, they think, well, they may not have a lot of experience. Or two, if you're older, they say, well, older people aren't as interested in learning new skills, or they might cost more to the organization. A variety of different concerns. And an employer also, I think it used to be, it's less of an issue now, looked at age and said, well, if someone's changing careers or jobs late in their career, there's probably a reason for that, and that reason is probably not good. I'll give you some examples here. My grandfather, who lived in Saskatchewan, most of his life in Moose Jaw, but also in Regina. Actually, most of his life in Regina, but also in Moose Jaw. He worked for basically one company his entire career. He worked for SAS Power for, I can't remember, I think it was 50 years. Somewhere around there, maybe less. But basically for one employer his entire career. And at the time, that was a sign of commitment to the employer and the employer to the employee. People found employment, found a job, did that job. And there wasn't as much mobility, and there wasn't as much change as we see today. My father worked as a journeyman electrician for a number of years, but he worked for a few different employers in a few different companies in a few different places. By contrast, I've had probably as many different careers as the two of them combined, and probably about as many employers as well. And so we used to see a lot more hesitation from employers when someone was older and changing careers. This is not so much the case anymore. I would say it's much less of an issue. Most employers recognize that people are looking for new opportunities, or even changing careers, industries, all these things at various stages in life. And that age doesn't really tell us about a person's capacity to learn new skills or be successful in a new job. So I would say this is much less of an issue than it used to be. Having said that, if we're concerned about it, or if we're worried that our education might seem out of date, we can remove the dates from our education, and we can list the last 3 jobs or the last 10 years, whichever is longer. You're not going to shorten a work experience. So if we say the last 10 years and you worked for a company for 15, you're going to list all 15. You're not going to say, well, I'm going to list those 10 years, but you're going to give the whole work experience with that employer. But this is one of the ways we manage age as a red flag. We say, well, what's a good size here? 36? Sure. Let's try that. We are going to and so this is one of the ways that we manage age as a red flag. Like I said, this is much less of an issue than it used to be. Employers are, I think, significantly less concerned, but there are employers who look at it and say, I don't know. Especially for something like a survival job or something like that. It's they're probably concerned that we're going to move on to something else. There's only so much we can do to help them with that concern. But this is one of the ways that we kind of manage it. Now, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt. I don't mind at all, or you can put them in the chat, or you can just unmute and go ahead.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I've been enjoying the class. Thank you so much for all the information. I just wanted to find out if it's okay for us to send you our resume, so and maybe the job description, if you can help proofread and maybe just take your feedback.
Yeah. So yesterday I mentioned it. I don't think you were here yesterday, but I'm glad you're here today. So welcome. Tomorrow we're going to look at how to write the bullets, and I'm going to give you time to work on that. And then on Thursday, we are going to dedicate that class to reviewing them in class once you've made some adjustments there. So absolutely, I'm happy to take a look at them. I do ask people to make some of the adjustments that we've talked about in the class first, so that you're as close to finished as you can be. And we always want to use a job posting when we're doing it so that we know what is relevant and things. I will send you a recording of yesterday's class so you can see anything you might have missed as well.
Okay, all right, thank you so much.
But yeah, absolutely happy to take a look. And there are times where sometimes people aren't able to get their resume looked at during the class on Thursday or last day together. And of course, if we don't get to it, you can always email it to me and we can schedule another time to discuss it or whatever. So yes, you'll definitely get a chance to have it reviewed. No problem.
All right, thanks.
Then I have a question, please.
Yes.
Regarding the gaps in the employment, for example, if someone didn't work for 6 months, 1 year, how he can manage to avoid to show it in the resume?
Great question. In fact, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about next.
Okay.
What I would say is that gaps in employment, the issue the employer has is, why are there gaps? What did the other employers know that I don't? So why was no one else hiring you? Did they know something I don't know? I would say if it's less than 6 months, I'm probably not worried about it. 3 months, I'm definitely not worried about it. Less than 6 months, I'm probably not super worried about it. It's the longer, it's extended periods of unemployment where we say, well, is there something that they don't know, or did they miss promotion, training, or experience by being out of the workforce? So gaps in employment, my goal when I apply for a job, whenever I'm thinking about gaps, is to simply avoid talking about them. Now, how do we do that? I'm going to show you here in just a second. Often the reason we're out of employment falls under one of the prohibited grounds. It could be for example, family status. Lots of people will step away from work to raise their family, they have children. We see a lot of other legitimate ones, people returning to school, people, some countries have mandatory military service. There's a ton of reasons that we might not be at work. And in my opinion, that's really none of the employer's business. Now, the employer might disagree with me, but my emphasis is on, when I list my work experience and it's from 2018 to 2024, really the thing that I'm focused on is this dash. What was I doing while I was at that job? And so how do we navigate this? Well, I want to jump back to our friend Jen and her resume, because I think it's going to offer some insight. So here's the thing. My goal is to downplay it or to avoid it because it's really none of the employer's business. That's the personal part of my life, not the professional part. So one of the ways we can do it is by using a functional resume. We're worried about gaps in employment. This is a work history barrier or challenge. And so de-emphasizing our work history de-emphasizes the barrier. The other thing we can do, so already in a functional resume, we're already saying, well, don't worry too much about this. Let's focus on this part here. The other thing it does is we can remove the months from the listing. And that tends to close, but it doesn't really close. It just de-emphasizes the gap. So what people probably didn't notice is that Jen actually has a bunch of gaps in her work history. And if you didn't notice it, mission accomplished. That's exactly the point. Jen was working. Where's my drawing tool here? I'll try and make this large. That's text. This is formatting. Here is 36 should do. Make it black. So she's working from 2008 to 2010. Don't know how you do it. And then she worked from 2010 to 2013. And I want to be consistent, so I'm going to put a space on either side of that dash. All right. I'll even make this a little bit larger. Easier to read. There we go. Now, in this context, if Jen includes months, let's say she's working here from February 2008 to, let's say, September 2010. This is less than a year, or no, it's more than a year, sorry. And let's say she gets this job in November of 2013, and then she leaves this job, let's say, what's a fun month? April? Sure. Why not? Here we've got not a super long break in employment, maybe a month or two here. And in fact, if she got this job in September, it's no time at all, right? There could be a weekend potentially between them. Or maybe one starts on the exact same day. Who knows? Now, having said that, if this is January and this is December, well, this is functionally almost a full year, which is starting to get a little worrisome for an employer. So one day, 1 year, by removing the months, we can represent both of those in the exact same way. So 1 day and 1 year, both of those would look exactly like this. So that's the first reason we might remove months. Now, here's the thing. Then Jen works from 2014 to 2015. And in this context, this could be December of 2013, and this could be January of 2014, and this could be 1 month. Or this could be January of 2013, and this could be December 2014. This could be 2 years. 1 day or 2 years, both are represented accurately in the exact same way when we remove months. Now, some employers will look at someone's work history, not see months, and go, I wonder if they're trying to close a gap. Well, we can include the months and prove it, or we can make them wonder and hopefully convince them that they should call us for an interview anyway. So it's not perfect, but it is better. When I look at Jen's work history here, she doesn't go for very long without employment, and she maintains employment, and most of that employment is over a year, so I'm feeling pretty confident about it. There's kind of two key areas to get past. One is 3 months, and one is 1 year. 3 months is, in employment standards, it's actually 13 weeks, they describe it. This is what we often call probationary period at the beginning of employment. An employer can end employment or terminate an employee within the first 3 months with no consequences. They don't have to give notice. They don't have to pay anyone extra money. And so if someone is unable to get past 3 months with an employer, people start to say, oh, you might have looked like a good candidate, but once they hired you, they realized you weren't a good fit. That happens sometimes. Once we're past the 3 months, they know that the employer has decided to keep us, to maintain our employment. That's a good thing. And once we're past a year, employers are feeling fairly confident that we are willing to make a commitment to an employer and stay. And so these are, the 1 year also allows us usually to list a range instead of, if it's less than a year, all of your employment might fall within 1 year, right? So it might all fall within 48. Whoa, in the future, that's wild. I meant 2018. And that makes it more difficult to list. If it's all within 1 year, but it's close to a full year, I would probably include months so that the employer sees that it's beyond that probationary period. But then I might feel obligated to include months everywhere else. Or I might be inconsistent because I think the formatting looks better, and I might simply include months for the years where it all falls in a calendar year. All that being said, once you're over a year of employment, what month you started in stops mattering as much because you're probably established within the job, you understand and are maintaining that employment. And so, if you work somewhere for 10 years, whether you started in May or June doesn't matter at all. So who cares about months? Some employers are weird though, and they decide they do care. Fair enough. Those goofy employers. Now, that's one of the ways we deal with gaps in employment. Same with job hopping. And here's the thing about it. With gaps in employment, one last thing I will say, if we have lengthy gaps, more than a year or two, like removing months doesn't really help us. Then sometimes we'll use a placeholder, but we're not going to add bullets. We're not going to add a lot of context to it. Our goal is to, what am I doing? Our goal in that case is to simply close that gap with the placeholder so that they're not thinking about it anymore. So we might have a placeholder, and so, if we took a leave from work to return to studies or something, we might have a placeholder that said returned to education, and that might be in our education. We'd have the date range at the other end, from 2020 to 2019. No, that would be back in time. That would be wild. I promise, I've typed on the keyboard before. I swear it's true. So we might, list something like that, or we might. We'll also sometimes see similar situations where, there's a number of different placeholders that people will use. If someone's relocating, or if they were, raising a family. There's lots of different kinds of placeholders we use. I try to avoid placeholders whenever possible because they tend to get messy and they tend to focus on the wrong thing. So I just try to avoid them, but they can be helpful in certain circumstances. Mm-hmm. Now, for job hopping, similar thing we can do. We can use a functional resume. That's going to de-emphasize the work history. Job hopping is a work history barrier or challenge. With job hopping, what we're talking about typically is a person moving or hopping from one job to another. They're not maintaining employment, either because they're afraid of that commitment or of getting fired, or employers are ending that employment maybe during a probationary period. So what the employer is worried about is we get a job, and then, can I do this? Come on down. And then we either get fired or we leave that job within a short period of time. And then we get another job, and then we leave that job. And then we get another job, and then we leave that job. And they're saying, why can't you keep a job? They're worried that this is them. And then in a couple of months, you're going to go to a new job. Now, there's a lot of work that can look like job hopping that isn't. I'll give you an example. Let's say I get an entry-level position, a survival job. And then I get a job in my industry. But that's not a lateral move. It's an entry-level position, but it's in my industry based on my training. That's not a lateral move. That's actually an improvement. And then I get a promotion. That's not, I'll try and line them up here. That's not a lateral move. That's career growth. Job hopping is not career growth. Job hopping is lateral moves from one entry-level job to another because we aren't maintaining or keeping employment. We keep moving on to new opportunities. It's not professional growth, it's lateral.
I have a question, please, Dale.
Yes.
So what is the duration of the position? For example, what is the duration of a job that I spent in a company? Then since then we can call it like job hopping. So is it about like minimum 6 months, 1 year, 2 years?
I would say it will depend on the employer and their perspective and how long they're hoping that a person will stay in employment. I would say anything under 1 year can start to look like job hopping. But as a general rule, I would say we're concerned about, if we took an average of employment, we're looking at 1, 2, or 3 jobs per year over a period of time. Now, there are jobs that look like this, right? Seasonal employment and contract work both look like job hopping. The difference with seasonal and contract work is these are designed to end. So job hopping, the employer wants to maintain that employment long term, but either the person's not a good fit or they leave before they can get fired. That's the concern. Seasonal or contract work is designed to end, right? Seasonal employment might, if you go to a grocery store or Home Depot right now, there are garden centers where you can buy plants and garden equipment and things like that. And they'll hire people for the summer season to work in those areas, but they close in the wintertime when people aren't growing things. Retail has a similar seasonal boost in employment in the fall, right before Christmas, as workplaces or retail stores will hire additional staff from September to December to help with the increase in traffic. Contract work often has a defined end date. Well, we're hiring you for a 1-year contract. That we might do a 1-year contract for 5 years in a row, and that's going to be 5 jobs in 5 years, and it looks like it might be job hopping. Here's what we can do. We can actually add this context to our work history. So let's go into my example here. Let's see, is it going to go? There we go. So let's say I've got my, let me copy this and paste this. I've got my work history. And let's say I was a English for Employment instructor with Regina Open Door Society for 2024. This might be a 1-year contract, and I could put contract next to it to help give that context to the employer, so they know maybe I was working as a garden center clerk at Home Depot, Regina, Saskatchewan, and that was in summer of 2023. Come on, Dale, you got this. And I'm going to remove this because down there. All right. I could put seasonal there so that they know why it ended. Maybe I got hired in, it wouldn't be uncommon, get hired in probably April, and it might last until September. I would try and be consistent in my abbreviations. But this is going to help them understand this job was designed to end. It is not the employer who's dissatisfied with me. I'm not dissatisfied with the employer. This is the nature of that employment. And you'll see it, lots of self-employed people, lots of people who, provide consulting and things like that will take 1-year contracts or will sign a contract with an organization or an employer, provide that service. It's designed to end. And so we would include that context to help them understand it. Now they're not worried that we're going to take off or run away because that's not what our history shows. So we're trying to help the employer understand what they think is a pattern. They're seeing a pattern or a behavior in our work history that isn't there. Now, if we are job hopping, it could happen, then the functional resume is going to be our first and best choice, de-emphasizing that work history. And it's going to be a challenge. And one of our goals would probably be to get and establish and maintain employment to break that cycle or pattern so that when an employer looks at our resume, they're not worried about it. Let's go back to Jen's employment here for just a second. Yes, she has a couple of breaks in her work history, gaps, right? But the number one way she overcomes that is by getting employed after the gap. So finding and maintaining employment after a gap in employment is the best way to overcome that barrier. Once one employer is willing to take a risk or take a chance on you, hire you, and you can demonstrate that continuity, the best thing that closes the gap between 2013 and 2014 for Jen is 2 years or more of employment here and then 2 more years of employment here, showing that she can get and maintain employment with other employers. So if you have a gap in your work history, but it's many years ago or it's several years ago, and you've been able to demonstrate good skills and abilities and experience since then, I would try not to draw attention to it by including a placeholder. I would simply list my work experience demonstrating that, again, all of this is a risk. Employers are just worried about risks. They say, oh, I hope that this doesn't happen to me. And if we can show that it won't, then they don't have to worry about it. So similar to like those interview questions where an employer says, oh, what's your greatest weakness? Or tell us about a time you failed. What they want to see is this going to impact their work with me? Am I going to be impacted by their weakness or by their past failures? And if we can show that it's not going to be an issue for the future employer, then they don't have anything to worry about. So that's always what we're trying to deal with here or mitigate are those concerns the employer has. So that's gaps in employment, job hopping. By contrast, a long time in one position is the opposite of job hopping. We got hired by an employer. What's that?
Like here it's like contradiction. First we are talking to not avoid changing jobs, then
Yes.
second point we have to show that we cannot stay like a long time in one position, so
I know, right?
tricky.
These employers, they're never happy. They're never happy. All they want is everything and more. Okay, yes, exactly. Frustrating. Why would an employer, okay, we know why they're worried about job hopping. They're worried they're going to hire someone, invest time and money, and that person's either going to be a bad fit or they're going to bail to go to something else. Why would they be worried about a person who's been in one position for a very long time? What would their concern be?
That person is not able to develop new skills, or he's afraid, so he's keeping in the same position.
Exactly. Or that the employer looks at that person and says, I don't think you're a good fit for promotion. You're a good fit for the job you have, but I'm worried that you haven't developed new skills, or that maybe you're good at this job, but you won't be a good leader, or you won't be able to elevate the kind of work you're doing. Exactly right. So these are the two kind of aspects. Are we worried about it and that additional responsibility, or is the employer worried about it? Either way, that's now what we need to address. So in this case, the concern and the thing we want to show is we want to show growth. We want to show increased responsibility. And in some cases, we can also be inconsistent in the way we demonstrate employment to address this. So let me give you an example. Let's say I worked as, my job is as an instructor, but I got a Bachelor of Education. I've taught in elementary schools and high schools. And if I had stayed there, my job would be classroom teacher. And unless I want to become a principal or move into admin, which I don't, sounds awful, then this is going to look like, by the time I retire, it's going to look like, oh, when would I like to retire? How does next year sound? Sounds good to me. No, probably not. But let's say I worked in a school for, 17 years?
Mm.
Oh, this is what it's going to look like. And every time another year passes, this just goes on. But the title doesn't change because I'm working for the same school board, the same division, in the same job. Except I'm not. As a teacher, every year I get a new class, a new grade. I might get a new subject if I'm in a high school. And so for that reason, careers like this, and there are others that are similar, I might say, okay, well, I'm going to organize this as, I could organize it as classroom teacher, or I could organize my work experience as the school division I worked for. I'm going to make this a little smaller so this all fits. Come on, Dale. Be faster. That's a little small. Let's go there. So I'll move this up a little bit higher. Say, okay, I work at Regina Public Schools for 2013 to 2030. But then I might break this into, this will be my bold thing. Then I might have a, then I might have some bullets there, and then I might talk about my experience teaching grade 7. And I might break that work history into the different responsibilities, the different duties I had, or how my role has changed over time. One other thing you can do, if you don't, this is a very convenient example for Dale because of how well it works, but in your job, you might have changing responsibilities. And so you might take those bullets under this title and you might break them into a skill section under the work history to kind of break up that into different duties or responsibilities and show growth over time. So there's a lot of different ways we can get creative in the way that we represent these experiences. We have that starting point that I've talked about, and we want to be consistent, but there are times where there's a problem with the way that consistency looks on our resume. It makes us look like we aren't growing, we aren't learning new skills. And in that case, we might say, again, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Is it worth looking inconsistent to overcome this barrier, like not growing professionally? The answer is probably yes. So let's look for ways to get creative in the way we demonstrate that information. So I'm going to be inconsistent in the way I display it, but I've got a good reason for it. And if that's the case, then it might be worthwhile. So this would be like a very convenient example. And for this one here, we might teach in this classroom from 2016 to 2019, and we might organize it that way. So it's going to depend. There are lots of times where we might work for the same employer, but in different jobs. We're getting promoted. And to avoid repeating the same employer over and over and over again in the same location, we might list the employer first and then the jobs underneath. Or maybe we find that our resume is like 1 1/3 pages long, and we want to push that to 1.5 pages. So maybe we will include the employer under each job title, and we will lengthen it. There's all kinds of ways we can play with our resume to make the optics better for us. So that's one of the other ways we might deal with a long time one position. As well, functional or combination hybrid, both of those are going to emphasize the skills section. Anytime we're creating a resume with a skills section, we're going to put the skills section first. We're taking those skills out to emphasize them, so it doesn't make sense that we put them further down the page. And because they're going near the top, what we're going to do is give the employer a lot to read before they get to that problem. So once again, the functional or combination is going to be a better bet. I will also say that a long time in one position is less of a big deal if you are a big deal. What I mean by that is if you're the president or CEO of the company, if you're the VP of a department, if you have got to the top of that professional ladder, staying there for a long time is not as big of a deal as if you are in an entry-level position being overlooked for a promotion. So what is the job? That matters too. And so VP of marketing doesn't look as bad for 10 years. Casual sales clerk for 10 years isn't going to be as convincing to an employer. So it depends on the role as well. Questions? All right. We are at noon. So we've got one more topic I want to look at today. And then tomorrow we are going to look at how we write the bullets. We've thought about the type of resume we're going to use. We've thought about the different sections we might have and the kinds of information we're going to share and how we'd write those entries, when we want to be consistent and when we might break a few rules to deal with some things that an employer might think are a concern. Now we got to write those bullets. That's going to be tomorrow. And so for tomorrow's class, you will need a job posting because we're going to talk about identifying keywords and writing bullets. Before we go today, I want to talk about one last thing. It won't take us the whole time. So if you're like, oh, today's really busy, you'll get some time to look for your job posting at the end of our class here today. But I want to talk a little bit about references, just because we have some time today. And tomorrow, I want to give you time to work on your resume so we can look at some on Thursday. So when we're talking about references, we mentioned this earlier. References, these are a witness that we're calling. We make a bunch of claims on a resume. I can do this. I can do this. I worked here. And then the employer says, why should I believe you? And we say, well, don't take my word for it. Here's 3 people you can ask. And we mentioned this yesterday. If you are providing references for an employer, how many are they going to ask for? How many do they want? Does anyone know?
Sorry, what was the question? Sorry.
How many, if an employer says, oh, did you bring references with you? How many references will be on our reference page?
How many? I think 3.
Correct. Unless they ask for a different number. Some employers will say, oh, we'd like 1 professional reference and 1 character reference. Or they'll say, we'd like 3 professional references. Or if they give us a different number, we'll do that. If they don't give us a number, it's 3.
Okay.
Now.
I have a question, please.
Yeah.
Or maybe you will speak a bit about it later. I don't know.
What's the question?
May I ask? Yes. For example, if they ask for the references, or maybe they will not ask, and we can mention it. We can say yes, we have references. So if you would like, we can give you a list of them. And these referees, for example, shall I mention people that I worked with them early in the beginning, or maybe in the middle, or maybe in the end, or maybe the fact that I'm mentioning some people that I work with them, the three of them are the first people that I work with them. This maybe can be suspicious for them. They will say, why she is mentioning these people really at the beginning of the career and not at the end, or maybe not in the middle.
Yeah. So here's what I would say. This is a really good question. How do we decide who to use for references, and what do those decisions tell the employer? Okay. Right? So so what you're saying is, if I choose 3 references from early in my career, you're thinking about when you were first starting out in architecture, I believe.
Yes.
You're thinking about, well, those are the skills that I'm going to be using in this new job. Some of those those things, right? And so you say, well, I'm going to choose people from that time because they're going to talk about the most relevant skills that I bring. But then you're also thinking, well, if I don't mention anyone recently, maybe they'll think that job didn't go very well and no one there wants to be a reference for me. So we're always looking for balance. We're choosing 3 people and we get to choose who these people are. They should say good things about us. They should be able to talk about skills and abilities we will use in the new job. So you're right. We do want people who are going to talk about relevant things, but we can find a balance. So what I might do in your situation is I might say, well, I want someone who can talk about the skills I will be using in this new job. So I'm going to ask someone from an earlier in my career because they saw that and they'll be able to explain it. But I also want that employer to know that I can grow within my career, I can improve, I can be someone that they can move up within their organization, and I can add additional value to their company. I also want them to know that my most recent experience, and maybe it's also a long piece of experience, went well, and I was a really valuable asset to that organization. So I'm going to pick someone from that job. And then I might say, well, I also want them to know that I understand Canadian workplace culture. I can step into a Canadian workplace and be successful. I was volunteering recently somewhere, and so I'm going to ask the volunteer coordinator or the manager at that organization if they'll be a reference for me so that I can show them that I can do that as well. And so we get to choose those references, and we want to think about what do we want those references to say, and where do we want to give that employer confidence. And then we're going to choose references that are going to support those things. So we can mix and match, is what I'm saying. So when I start a job search, the first thing I ask myself is who would make a good reference for me and who can I actually get in contact with? And then I'm going to make the longest list I can. And then I'm going to probably narrow it down to like the best candidates, but I'm not going to limit my initial search to 3 people. If I've got 6 or 7 people that I think would be good references for me, I'm going to contact all of them. And I'm going to say, hey, would you be willing to be a reference for me? And they're going to either say yes or no. They need to say yes if you're going to use them. Employers expect when you provide a reference that you have spoken to your reference, they have agreed to be your reference, and they are ready to talk. Now, having said that, easier said than done sometimes. And I'll talk about some ways we can deal with that. Now I'm going to contact all those references and say, hey, I'm looking for employment. Employers here expect me to have references, people who will confirm what I'm claiming on my resume. I'm wondering if you would be willing to be a reference. They say, sure. I say, great. What's your contact information? I'm going to show you what we need for that in just a minute. And I say, cool. When I use you as a reference, I will let you know so that you can be prepared. And so when I apply for a job, if I don't give the contact information, I'm not going to talk to my references yet. They're already ready. They already know. Once I get called for the interview and I create my reference page and I'm planning to give it over to the employer, I'm going to let my references know. And I'm going to send them the job posting and the resume I used so that they don't have to be as prepared as me for the interview, but I just want them to know like what I'm doing so they can focus on the correct part, so that they can emphasize the things that are going to be valuable. They should always say good things about us. These are people we hand pick. So if they're like, they weren't great, it's going to be a big problem. It should be someone who has seen us work. We want firsthand witnesses, not hearsay. So we'll talk about that. But here's the thing, work can look like a lot of different things. When we were in university, when we were in school, when we went to courses and we participated and we worked in groups and we asked questions and we shared and we managed our time and we submitted assignments, that was work. And we were demonstrating valuable workplace skills in a different context. When we volunteered, we did work. So there's a lot of different ways that work can look, and it doesn't always have to be in a workplace. Although that does tend to be the most credible. And then we're going to send them that info so they can be prepared. Now, if that employer or that reference is outside of Canada, there's a couple of ways we can deal with it. One is to make sure that we get their email address. Employers will sometimes have forms or PDFs that people can fill out instead, and that helps deal with time zones and language barriers to a degree. We can also ask our references for a reference letter. If that person is difficult to get a hold of, or they're like, yeah, I can't guarantee that, or maybe the time zone is like the opposite of the Canadian time zone, so they're really only available in the middle of the night. We can say, hey, would you mind writing a letter with a brief description of my duties and responsibilities and what I was like as an employee? We can attach a copy of that to our reference page. And for many employers, that's as good as the phone call. So those are some of the ways that we can manage it. One thing I do want to also clarify here, hold on one second, close this, is that references are not the same as referrals. You'll hear people talk about referrals as well. That's different. So references have seen you work. Referrals may have, but not necessarily. once you've worked in the labor market and you start applying for jobs in that labor market, a referral and a reference could be the same. So let's say, for example, I had a supervisor I worked with, and then they went to a new company and they got hired there. And then they called me and they said, hey, Dale, there's a position opening up here you'd be great for. The pay is better, the benefits are better, and it'd be great to have you on our team. I might say, oh, great. Do you mind if I mention that I talked to you in my cover letter? That would be a referral. But once I get the interview, I might still use that person as a reference. They might be, because they've seen me work, they could be a reference as well. For your references outside of Canada, they're not going to be referrals. They're not going to know the employer. So references are typically unknown to the employer, although not always, but they don't have to be. They're the witness who verifies our claims. A referral is known to the employer. The purpose of a referral is leveraging your network. What we're doing is we're saying, hey, I know this person and you know that person, so you should interview me, right? Hey, do you know so-and-so? Yeah, they're great. You know, I worked with them. Oh, well, they're a good employee. We trust their judgment. Maybe we'll see what they have to say. So referrals is really about leveraging your network, whereas references are about calling witnesses who can verify your claims. Referrals, if they get mentioned in the cover letter. So you might say, please accept my application for the position of employment readiness instructor at Regina Open Door Society. After speaking with Zach's startup, I know I would be a great candidate for this position. And as you can see, based on my experience working at blah, 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 blah. I mentioned Zach because Zach works there already and they know Zach. And so if I know Zach, maybe that makes me a good candidate. By contrast, references get mentioned either on the resume or on the reference page. So they're different and they're doing different work. I also mentioned that there are strong references and there are references that aren't as strong. As a general rule, supervisors, employers, or clients, if we're self-employed, these are the people whose job it is to evaluate our work. So if a supervisor or employer says, hey, they can do this, that's their reputation. As a professional, a client says, hey, they did good work for me, that's convincing. Less convincing, professors, volunteer coordinators, HR professionals, coworkers, it's not necessarily their job to evaluate us, but we're doing work-like things in a volunteer or educational setting. Our coworkers don't necessarily evaluate us, but they know if we made their jobs harder or easier, right? Were we easy to work with? Was our product good? HR knows whether or not we met the expectations of the job. They have access to our performance reviews. They may be able to write a job description outlining our skills and abilities. As we go down this list, it gets less convincing. Respected community members might have a lot of credibility in their opinion. They might be able to talk about us as and our character, but less convincing. They probably haven't seen us work. Friends are even less convincing. And as we get down here, we start to see an increase in bias. Our friends presumably like us, so they're going to be less likely to be objective. They're more likely to say, yeah, Dale's great. He's wonderful. I love him. He's my best friend. Cool. Here's the thing, though. We all have friends who we love as friends that we wouldn't necessarily want to be coworkers with, right? So that's okay, but friends are going to be less convincing. Further we go down here, eventually we end up family members, super biased. You know, I'm not going to ask my mom to be my reference. Oh, Dale's her special little guy. She remembers when he was this big and she used to rise. So he's perfect. He can't do anything wrong. Dale's the best son a mother could hope for, especially after Mother's Day yesterday, the day before that. Who could ask for more than a loving son like Dale? Well, here's the thing. No employer is going to take my mom's opinion about me very seriously because they know she wants me to be successful. They know she has bias. She has subjective thinking. And the irony, of course, is that if they asked my mom, she would tell them exactly what she thought about Dale. He may be a great son. I'm kidding. Of course, we get along just fine. And we did have a lovely Mother's Day, and it was a good time. So here's the thing. Bias is a lot like conflict of interest. It's not about whether or not there is bias or there is conflict of interest. It is the fact that it could exist that makes it a problem. And so for that reason, the further we get down on this list, the less credible these people are going to be in an employer's eyes. So we want to grab people from the top of this list whenever possible. And if you don't have a lot of Canadian references, I would look at volunteer opportunities. It's a great way to get into Canadian work environments or environments that look a lot like workplaces. It's a great way to show responsibility, time management, interpersonal skills, all of these workplace culture and communication skills that tend to be what employers are focused on. We're not worried that someone who works in Microsoft databases won't be able to work in Microsoft databases in Canada. We know that those are going to be pretty much the same. Employers are worried that people aren't going to have the workplace culture and communication skills, aren't going to understand their rights and responsibilities in the workplace, and that's going to impact their ability to be successful. But also sometimes employers, they're just lazy and they don't want to provide that training. So they'd rather a volunteer organization or an entry-level job provided those skills or confirmed those skills instead. So strong references that can show that we have those skills are going to help us access opportunities sooner, hopefully, sooner than later. Now, once we talk to those references, we need to get this information here. We need their name, their current job title, their current organization, so where are they right now? And if they've retired, we could list it as former, their phone number and their email address. And in some cases, this is optional, their relationship to us. I'll give you an example. So let's say I'm applying for a job and I think, oh, I'm going to use my previous supervisor from my last position. So I say, John, will you be a reference for me? He says, Dale, you're the best employee I ever had. It would be an honor to be a reference for you. I say, thanks so much, John. It's very kind. Save it for the phone call. And I say, oh, so what title, what organization should I list? And he's going to say, well, I'm currently the Regina Community Association Executive Director. So I'm going to list job title, and then I'm going to list the organization. Now, here's my problem. We both work together at Saskabilities. Neither of us works there anymore. I have no connection to the Regina Community Association. I haven't worked there. I haven't volunteered. So who is John to Dale? Who is this person? What is he going to talk about? What can he share? The employer doesn't know. So I need to provide, at the bottom here, a relationship line. So I'm just going to describe his relationship to me. He was my supervisor at Saskabilities. Now the employer looks at my work history, they see Saskabilities, and they go, oh, this is what Dale was doing. So this employer, or this person, John, can speak to what Dale was doing in that workplace. Great. Now we know what kind of questions to ask him. Now we know what kind of feedback he's going to be able to provide. I'm going to get his phone number. If I need to provide a country code, I'm going to do that. You could even include the time zone to make it easier for the employer to know when to call. If they're outside of Canada, I'm going to do my best to get an email address as well. And like I said, you can add that at the bottom here. We can list these vertically, or we can list them horizontally on our reference page. As a general rule, I'll show you how I would do this. 1 second. Can I? Hold on. Let's see if this is going to let me do this. This would be nice, please. Oh, nice. That was almost going to be tough, but now it's not. Okay. No one knows what you're talking about, Dale, because you paused your screen. Okay. Here we go. So let's say I'm in this document here. This is my letterhead. Well, I'm going to do something very similar for my reference page. I'm going to clear my page here. Now, I wouldn't necessarily do it this way. I'd probably open a new document, but I'm going to keep my letterhead at the top. And then I'm going to include my references. Now I'm going to have a heading for it. And I'm going to here, make that bold. I think I increased the size. What did it look like? I'm going to use the same headings I use here. So I'm going uppercase, and I'm going, I think it's one size larger, and I'm underlining it because I want it to be consistent. I want it to look like it came from the same place. And I might make adjustments based on that. And then I'm going to include my references. Oh, that I made a huge mistake. I didn't make a huge mistake, but we'll fix this. Undo. There you go. So here's that information for John Doe. I could include it like this. I'm probably going to get rid of the spaces in between, list it like this. I could absolutely list my next two vertically like this. Also, you can go horizontally across. Because this is information that we don't need the applicant tracking system to grab, I could also use a table here. If I want to go horizontally, I could insert a table that's going to look like this, and I can drag this up here, and I'm going to do a better job than that, of course, and then I'm going to get rid of all the borders, and so I could have it vertically, or I could list it horizontally, whatever's going to work. And it'll depend on how my letterhead looks. But this is also, if the employer requests that we include it on our resume, there are times where they'll say, submit it with your resume. If you have room at the bottom, you could list it like this, it's going to use the space a lot more effectively at the bottom. And you could put that at the bottom of your resume if they request it at the time of application.
I have a question, Dale.
Yes.
If I don't have all this information, for example, is it a problem? For example, if I mention just the name, the position, the phone, and email, for example, or maybe not the phone, maybe just the email, or one of them, telephone, or maybe.
Yeah,
Is it
ideally,
acceptable still?
yes. When we exclude that information, an employer might look at it and say, well, do they not want me to call them? Why are they not? So ideally, we would gather as much as possible. We want the employer, they may have a preference for how they contact people. So we want to give them as much as possible, but if we don't have it, we don't have it. Your employer, the employer, your reference should expect a call. They should know they are your reference. I'll give you an example. And I often mention this. I had a client, this is many years ago. They had applied for a job. It was an entry-level role, and they'd gone for the interview. They didn't know they needed references. They'd had a part-time job. I think it was at like a convenience or grocery store. It was a small local business, and they'd worked there casually for a few months before they left that job. Under good circumstances, they got along well with the employer, and they'd been successful. And I think they may have gone back just to school or something like that. And they were now looking for another sort of entry-level job. And the employer, at the end of the interview, asked if they had any references, and they didn't know they needed them. So they gave the name and the phone number for their manager at the previous store, but they haven't talked to that person. That person doesn't know. The new employer, immediately after the interview, calls before that person even has a chance to contact their reference, and says, "Hey, I'm calling for a reference check for this person." And the previous employer said, "Oh, I don't know who that is." Yeah. Now, here's the thing. In an entry-level job like that at a local store, there may be a high level of turnover. A part of it was that the person used a nickname at work, so a shortened form of their name. So the new employer was asking for the person's name as it appeared on the resume, whereas that previous employer, they thought of that person as their nickname. They weren't ready for the call. They weren't expecting it. And so they were like, "Sorry, I don't know who you're talking about. Yeah, good luck." Now, if this person contacts their reference in advance, they say, "Oh, hey, I'm applying for jobs." That person is now expecting a phone call at some point. They're also going to get a copy of that person's resume so they can, see how it compares to the job posting. They're going to see the person's name at the top of the resume. They're going to make that connection. It's all going to be top of mind, and there's going to be less room for confusion and concern. So we can avoid some of those things. It wasn't that the old employer was trying to be disrespectful or rude or ruin that person's career. Just unfortunate set of circumstances. And I think that the worst part of it is that if an employer asks for your references, they say at the end of an interview, "Oh, do you have references with you?" That doesn't mean anything. They might just be being polite. You could have the worst interview ever. They could be like, "Hey, we're never hiring this person. Make a note. Never hire them." And they would still ask for references to be polite and to keep their options open. You could have the best interview and they would ask for them, or the worst. Either way, they would ask. If they are calling your references, it's a very good sign. Employers don't call references for people they aren't considering hiring. If they are calling your references, you're either the final candidate or one of the final candidates, and they're using those references to help them make the decision. So being in contact with your references also means that they can let you know, "Hey, I got a call today from that new employer, said good things, good luck, just wanted to let you know." That can give you an idea of how successful you were in the interview. You may still not get the job, but you'll know, okay, well, I did well enough to be considered for that role. It can, even when you don't get the job, it can be a nice boost to your self-esteem, especially if you're having a frustrating time. And it can be a way of knowing whether or not you were successful in the interview. They may not give you feedback, but if they're calling a reference, you have a sense that the interview must have gone well enough that they're considering hiring you. So you can say, "Oh, I guess I did prepare well for that. Good." So it can give you a sense of how you're doing in that process. So they ask for them doesn't mean anything, but if they call them or contact them, it's quite a good sign.
I have one more question, please.
Yes.
If you're asking for the references, shall I give them like a hard copy, or maybe I can send them by email?
If it's an in-person interview, take a hard copy.
Okay.
If it's an online interview, it's probably going to be a digital document. I would save it as a PDF, same format as you would for your resume and all that.
Okay.
So online, phone, I'm probably emailing them. In person, I'm taking a hard copy for sure.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And this is where I will say we all have different access to printers and things like that. Staples is a great place if you need to print out a resume or a reference page for an interview. Staples is like an office supply store. They've got a couple of locations, and they all have a printing center where if you take your documents in on a USB, you can print them for like 5 or 10 cents a page. It's pretty cheap. Our office also has a center, like a computer center where you can go and print documents as well. So if Staples has better hours than we do, but if it's during the week, our office, people can always come in and print documents as well. So that's what I wanted to mention about references. Any other questions? Anybody at all? Okay. If you have questions, feel free to email me. I'm going to take a look at some of those letterheads after today's class. If you want me to give you verbal feedback right now, you can just stay in the workshop and I can bring it up. For everyone, though, tomorrow we are going to look at skills and abilities. And for that, you will need a job posting because we don't know what's relevant or what to emphasize if we don't have a job posting. So what I need everyone to do is, some point in time today,